Hello, this is Matthias Goertz with my monthly COVID-19 update. As always, I will share my screen, if I can find it. Oh. There we are. So what you see here is that 32,000-year-old horse that I think I talked about last time when I talked about when I think human civilization peaked. I think in my analysis, or in my subjective opinion, it didn't peak 32,000 years ago. It peaked during the so-called Magdalene period, when some of the main cave paintings were crafted by humans. So that's not quite as long ago as this, but maybe 15 to 20,000 years ago. That's when I think humanity peaked in terms of humanity being at its most human. And remember, human, in my definition, has a brain and a heart and an immune system. And since then, it has been gradual decline with the Neolithic Revolution, when we became agriculturalists. That was a major step towards decline, and then, ever since. And I've argued that with the last 2 years with the COVID, we are now less human than Homo sapiens sapiens, or what I call Cro-Magnon man, has ever been. We have given up everything we've gained over those 45,000 years that we've been around as a species or subspecies. We've given all of that, or most of that, up. So I'm using this horse just to illustrate what I mean by being a human. I mean, this to me is one of the most beautiful pieces of art I've ever seen. It's made from mammoth tusk. It's found in a cave in southern Germany, together with other artifacts. There's quite a number of them from around the same period. I find this one particularly beautiful, but there are several beautiful ones. And there are, of course, many, many other artifacts, some even older, many a little bit younger, that are just astounding. What humans can do, right, when they get to it. And the conditions were that we were basically a hunting society, some gathering as well, but mostly hunting for protein. But one that in the interglacial period between two major ice ages, when temperatures were somewhat comfortable, especially around Europe, where many of these artifacts are being found. And it seems that there was a stable population, maybe a few 100,000, maybe 1 or 2 million humans. And it seems that they were comfortable enough to develop arts, probably some sort of religion or rituals, because the cave paintings, for example, they quite likely relate to rituals. They will have observed the stars, they will have philosophized about life, and they had, of course, fire at that time. They didn't necessarily always use it for cooking, but for the most part, by that time, probably they did. Although, they didn't have to necessarily. It becomes much more important as a cooking device when you have agriculture. Right? So they could actually live without cooking their food. But they had fire for sure, and they used it primarily to keep themselves warm. And we can imagine to sit around the campfire in the evening when they had leisure, tell stories, and develop a language that isn't that different from our languages today. and tell each other stories that are not different from the stories we tell ourselves nowadays. And in many ways, really culturally become truly human. So all the things that we associate with being human, including the art and storytelling and religion and our beliefs, burying their death, respecting their death. I don't want to paint a naive picture of some ideal society, but in many Greek myth, there's talk of this golden age. And I think there was a golden age during that time. And I really truly believe it's never quite been achieved again. And we are now about as far away from that golden age as possible. And the reason I'm saying that is, if you object, yeah, but we have 8 billion people today and they only had maybe 1 or 2 million or so, isn't it great that so many people are able to live on this planet? And I would say, well, if they behaved like humans, maybe that would be even great. I don't know. But they don't, right? I mean, the vast majority of us aren't behaving like humans. And the point is, these 2 million people who lived then, they all behaved like humans, probably. I mean, I'm imagining this. I cannot time travel back, unfortunately. I would love to. But I'm imagining this. I imagine them as every single one of them being truly human. Every single one of them, man or woman or child, mattered. Every life, imagine that, mattered. We are now living in a period where our lives don't matter at all. We've completely given up on giving any value to our lives. We are just vegetating like a vegetable. And you may say, no, but not all of us, Matthias. That's maybe you speak for yourself. I don't see where I am. It's always a limited view, I acknowledge. It cannot be everywhere at once, but I don't see anybody living where I am. Nobody. I don't see anybody, or almost anybody, that has a brain, a heart, and an immune system and trust in them. It's gone. So these people, I bet, had all three in spades. And they were becoming fully conscious of that fact. The fact that they had brains and hearts and immune systems. They, at this period, and maybe for another 10 or 15,000 years after this horse, humans became conscious of being human. Yeah. And we are now 32,000 years after the horse, have become literally unconscious of being human. We've given up the consciousness of being human. So the title, so that's why the horse is here, just to be clear. And I've changed the subtitle. I don't call it COVID any longer because COVID is just one aspect of this. I call it Update on the Human Condition. And the title today is, Will the Planet Save Us? We need saving. We are in need of saving. There are these funny notions sometimes lately when we had these so-called climate change conferences, that we humans must save the planet. Have you seen that? Yeah, and people talk about, they write it on, these paper boards and hold it up. Save the planet. What these people evidently do not recognize is the planet doesn't need any saving. Us, we need saving. So I've been praying to the planet. No, I'm not really into prayer. I'm hoping that our planet will save us. I still think it's not too late. I think the planet can still save us, but that may not be so forever, right? I mean, nature discards monsters, life forms that just don't work, right? That just don't function properly, get discarded, right? And I said before, if we have such a huge brain that uses up so much energy, but we don't use it, nature will not allow that to pass for very long. Yeah. I'm not saying we are doomed. I'm not a doomsday person or something like that. But we know from experience, species come and go. Sometimes they go quite quickly maybe hundreds of years or even thousands. I mean, quickly in the sense of, the time span of the Earth. But that's fairly quickly, because they're no longer fit to live, to survive as a species. So yeah, let's hope that the planet saves us, because I mean, I was always thinking that we would do that job ourselves, right? We would save ourselves. But I've lost a bit of that trust in humanity, as you may be able to tell. I'm no longer convinced that we, by our own intellect, for example, will be able to save ourselves. I'm no longer fully confident in that. Until 2 years ago, I was. Right? I'm not saying we won't, right? I still think that more likely than not, we probably somehow will, but it's by no means given. Yeah. And we will have to potentially rely on a benign planet to let us live. So in some form or shape. Yeah. So yeah, will the planet save us? So it happens I read a book last couple of weeks, Robert Ardrey, The Hunting Hypothesis. Now, this is quite interesting. It's not really a new hypothesis. You can see the book is 45 years ago. And even when he wrote it, this hypothesis was not entirely new, but he brought it to a point quite well, which is that for the most parts of human history, Homo, from Homo habilis, maybe, that is maybe not really Homo yet, but then Homo erectus, all the way to Homo sapiens sapiens, which is us. For almost that entire time span of a few million years, 2.5 million years, let's say, we've been hunters. Yeah. And more than that, he argues compellingly that it is that very hunting lifestyle, if you like, that made us who we are today, that made us human. And it links to climate change. That's why I bring it up, because it's in the context of climate change. Temperatures cooling. And until, let's say, 2.5 million years ago, the forest, the rainforest or similar, rich forest with lots of fruit provided a wonderful, almost paradisical environment in which our ancestors lived at a time when they were so closely related to, apes, right? They were no longer apes, I guess, but they were still living a somewhat similar lifestyle to today's apes, right? Who live in forests typically, and mostly gather fruit. They do occasionally they kill animals and eat them. They eat meat occasionally. They are omnivores, but they primarily rely on plants and primarily on fruit, which they find in rainforests. So they are our modern apes, and even our ancient predecessors were tied to the forests, because the forest provided them what they needed. It didn't only provide those nutrients that they needed, it also provided shelter and safety, because they were very apt at climbing up the trees, just like the apes are today. Some more than others, you know. I know some heavy gorillas are not so good at climbing up, but they have other defenses, such as canine teeth and big bodies and strength. But anyway, so the idea was most of these species at the time were arboreal, meaning they would live largely in forests. They would come down to the forest floor sometimes to gather things, but they would sleep up in the forest for safety. They would rear their children up in the forest, and they were basically arboreal. And that was, in a way, a very sustainable lifestyle until the climate changed. It got cooler in Africa. This was in Africa, and these forests in which our ancient antecedents lived began to shrink. And they made place for savanna, open savanna with very few trees. So most of these ancient species, you know, pre-humans or early humans, or, you know, apes or ape-type relatives of us, their habitats shrunk year after year after year, perhaps, and so did their populations, but they clung to that lifestyle. They did not innovate their lifestyle, if you like. I'm sure they had some innovations too, but basically they clung to that lifestyle, to their trees, but the ecosystem that could sustain them got ever smaller. And so therefore their populations got ever smaller too. But they could sustain themselves to this day in the form of our apes and maybe monkeys, if you like. So they could survive, but precariously, ever more precariously, the more the climate cooled, because those forests just shrunk. At the same time, the savanna expanded. So there was, if you like, a new or much expanded ecosystem, which became populated with, you know, basically mostly plant eaters, antelopes or what have you, and a few predators. Yeah, I mean, you know, the African savanna today, you have a picture, right? Lions and leopards and cheetahs, right? And some hyenas and some African wild dogs, or whatever they're called, these quite ferocious little dogs that hunt in packs and are very, very efficient hunters. So they're not just lions and cats, there are also some dogs and hyenas. So there's and then of course the scavengers as well. So there are some amount of meat eaters, but, you know, the main population in the savanna are plant eaters who eat grass and leaves, you know, that type of thing, right? So it's probably what we're thinking of here is not so different from today's African savanna as you can see it on TV, or if you ever did a safari, you've experienced it yourself. Yeah, so that was the new environment which expanded. And so at some point, our ancestor, one of these species of, you know, ape or early humanoid type creatures, one of them decided to try out the savanna. And it changed its lifestyle. Of course, we can imagine over many, many thousands of years, it may have been, you know, back and forth between spending some time in the forest and some time in the savanna. You know, maybe during the daytime, they would venture out into the savanna, they would maybe hunt or scavenge. And then in the evening, for safety, they would go back to their tree. So they would never move very deep into the savanna, not any further than they could sort of walk back. I mean, that's possible, right? We can imagine these interim, you know, lifestyles. But over time, that's the bottom line, over time, they developed upright walk and flat feet, as we know them today, as we have them today, which are perfect for walking on a plain, like a savanna, not very good for climbing, you see, I mean, up the trees, right? So at some point, early humans or humanoids made the step from being predominantly arboreal and their whole body shape being geared towards being arboreal, excellent climbers, not very good walkers. You just have to look at, chimpanzees, right? You get the picture. They are, they walk on their knuckles, and they can erect, but not for very long, because their pelvic structure isn't really geared towards upright walk very well, right? So they, they wobble when they walk, but in the trees they are champs, right? They're like, whoosh, right? So they're not very good walkers. So at some point, Homo became a walker, and at the same time, of course, lost some of that climbing ability. Now there may, as I say, there will be interim species which could do a little bit of both, right? But they were maybe not really perfect in either, But at some point, it probably switches over, because if both functions aren't really working well, I think you're vulnerable, right? So at some point, evolution would almost like force a switch. It's either here or there, right? Either you're arboreal or you're not, right? So, and at some point, that switch happened in our history, and we became walkers, upright walkers. And the other, of course, important element of going to the savannah was that your main source of calories started changing, right? In the arboreal ecosystem, it was fruits and maybe some other leaves, some roots, and so on, some basic plant material, with the occasional piece of meat thrown in, right? So even chimpanzees today are known to occasionally hunt. They seem to be hunting more for fun, actually, than for the food. So they really don't need that meat to sustain themselves. So they go hunting for fun in a group. And then they may eat the food they hunted, but so enjoy it, but they don't, that's maybe like a dessert for us, right? It's nice to have, right? But you don't really need it to sustain yourself, right? And so for them, hunting is a bit like having a snack that is fun, having a party, right? But they're not dependent on hunting, right? But these savanna species, the savanna species that we're talking about, that became our ancestors, they at some point shifted to primarily depending on meat. And there's debate, even in the book, Hunting Hypothesis, a debate, how quickly could they learn to hunt, or were they maybe initially scavengers, but then there's arguments against the scavenger hypothesis. Could they have been gatherers, like gather things in the savannah? But, if you've ever been to the savannah, there isn't very much to gather for us. So antelopes can feed off the grass, or elephants can feed off those bushes and trees, but we, even early humans probably didn't find very much to gather. They may have found some grass with seeds. Today, of course, a big part of our food intake is seeds, right? The different seeds that from maize to rice to wheat and whatnot, that we are, of course, today, commercially, agriculturally grow, right? That's a big part of our diet today. But in order to eat seeds, you need to have fire, and you need to use fire to cook it, because our stomach is not well capable of breaking down these very hard membranes of these seeds unless we cook it. So cooking, if you want to have a plant-based diet, cooking becomes very important later on. There's no evidence we may not know, right? But there's no evidence that these early humans or humanoids had a different acidity in their stomach that would have allowed them to eat significant amounts of seeds. So even though there may have been some wild seeds in the savannah, possibly, there's no good reason why that would have been a major part of their food. They were at that time not even yet really controlling fire, as far as we know. They may have occasionally dared to snatch fire when there was a natural firebrand in the savannah. There will be frequent, right? And some humans maybe took to snatching a piece of wood that was on fire, and and feeling very good about their bravery, which was probably bravery for them, because animals, as you know, normally avoid fire, right? So that is a step towards gaining control of fire, right? But because they lived in a warm climate, they didn't really need fire for keeping warm. And there are just no evidence that they ate a lot of seeds. So we haven't found anything in where we find their bones. We don't find anything like seeds can actually survive. I mean, if they're crystallizers, so we could find them today if they had had a lot of seeds, but we don't find them. So there's no evidence that they used fire to cook, and there's no evidence that they could digest seeds, without the help of fire. So most likely they didn't, right? Most likely they didn't eat a lot of plants. Almost the entire food supply depended on meat. Not maybe immediately, as I say, there may have been a transition period, but eventually. So they became hunters. They become hunters, and they had upright walk. And that is, of course, because it helped them on the savannah, but even more importantly, because, the walking is easier. But even more importantly, you could argue, yeah, but the antelopes, they don't walk on 2 legs, they walk on 4, and they do wonderfully. Or the lions, for that matter. Correct, right? So something happened where, because they came from the trees and they were used to using your hands. I mean, even if you look at an ape today, you will see their hands are quite similar to ours, right? They cannot grab things quite the way we do. With our thumb juxtaposed, their thumb maybe partially juxtaposed, I'm not sure, but they can still grab around like a branch to climb, right? But their fingers, I think, are elongated, and so they can wrap their whole hand around a branch and so on. So anyways, their hands are perfect for climbing, but they also use their hands for picking fruit or collecting fruit. And occasionally we see that in apes today, they even use tools. They may use a stone to crack open a nut, or they may use a stick to get at some, fruit that is somewhere, where it is not easy to reach or whatever, right? So there's an early indication in our apes today that they use tools to some degree, right? That may not have changed in the last 2.5 million years. So in other words, those early humans that went into the savannah, they already probably were using their hands in some capacity. For climbing, of course, when they came, after they came from the forest, initially they will still have had some kind of climbing hand, but more and more that functionality will have shifted from using the hands for climbing. The more they live fully in the savannah and eventually completely forwent the forest and lived entirely in the savannah, they had this dexterity of their hands, which was useful, right? They could use it to make things, to grab things, and they did. And I think the core of the so-called hunting hypothesis is the key element, the key item that they grabbed with their hand was weapons. The reason they were able to be successful hunters in the savannah was that they could hold a weapon, a big stone or a club, that they found in some tree or broke off the tree. Of course, later they would start making weapons and tools, right? But initially, maybe they just grabbed something. But they were able to grab a big stone or grab a piece of hard wood like a club and use it, right? And the hunting hypothesis that that's the only way they could possibly have survived as hunters without having the usual hunting equipment, claws, for example. Already when they were living in the trees, they had lost their claws because they didn't need them. They didn't use them for defense because they would just climb up the tree and they would feel safe, right? They wouldn't need them for hunting because they were just gathering, and they already then had transformed into the fingernails we have today. If you look at modern apes, again, you see similar fingernails as ours, right? In all likelihood, that process of, us losing the claws had already more or less been completed by the time we arrived in the savannah. So we didn't use claws to kill our hunting prey. We used weapons from the beginning. That's the argument, and I think it's very compelling. In the 70s, it was not an argument that everybody liked because, a lot of people said, no, we humans, we didn't start out as being so warlike and using weapons all the time. No, we were so peaceful. No, we weren't. We were vicious hunters using weapons early on, and that was our competitive advantage over anybody else, any other predator. And that's how we survived and developed. So in the moment where you realize it's the combination of the upright walk, freeing up your hand, also, of course, upright walk in the savanna is an advantage in terms of field of vision. You can see very far, you can see prey very far away, right? Much further away than, for example, a lion or leopard could, because they are low further down, right? They rely more on their smell, but humans will have had excellent vision, and they will have seen their prey at a great distance because they were walking upright. And they would also see any kind of enemy, like another predator, early on, right? And get ready to defend themselves with their weapon. Right? So it makes a lot of sense, the combination of upright walk and free hand that was able to grab things and then using a weapon made a lot of sense. And that's the combination that made us survive. Now, so the argument goes to Mr. Adry and others, what then turned us truly human was with that combination of upright walk, flat feet, clawless hands, and weapons that we were wielding, our brain size increased dramatically. Why? It's that combination of vision, there's a big visual part in the cortex, right? Grasping things very well, more than almost any other animal. We are very fine-tuned in terms of, touching things and taking them and using them and, tinkering with them, especially weapons, right? Plus the strategizing and the tacticians, the tactical sort of thinking involved in hunting. And here's the key. Adry argues, again, I think compellingly, we could have been successful as hunters only in a group, even with the weapon. If a single man tries to, imagine you have a club in your hand, your maximum speed is, I don't know, 30 kilometers per hour, but only for a very short time, a sprint for 100 meters. And after that, it goes down to like 10 to 15. So for any kind of longish period of time, our maximum speed is maybe like 10 kilometers per hour, right? And remember, those predecessors of ours were smaller than us, so they were probably slower. And you wield this axe, or not even axe, just a piece of wood, right? So imagine trying to catch an antelope. Well, good luck, right? They wouldn't have, right? They wouldn't have. Now, there may, of course, at the time have been some other animals that are slower, possible. When humans first got into savanna, maybe there were animals that had not yet been exposed to so many predators, so they were slower, they didn't have good defenses, and humans were able to hunt them on their own, possible, even likely, probably, at least for some time, But of course, if you hunt those animals to extinction, eventually they're gone, right? So they cannot sustain those sort of easy to catch animals. Evolution wouldn't allow that to go on for very long. Either it would make them more formidable in escaping or in fighting, or they would just go away, right? So you can't rely on like easy prey forever. That's not going to be happening, because it's constant in nature. There's constant competition between predator and prey, right? A constant arms race, right? But the thing that humans had going for themselves, and again, we even see that in monkeys, monkeys and in apes, although only to a limited degree, is cooperation. So Adry argues that we could only be successful as hunters in a group, 4, 5, 6 humans together hunting an antelope. So you could encircle it from all sides, and then corner it and then kill it. Right? And I think that makes a lot of sense. Right? So, so even lions do that, right? Even lions are very good at cooperating, but they don't necessarily have to. They can do it by themselves, but often they collaborate because it's easier, right? And the success rate is higher. But for humans, it was probably virtually the only way to hunt was in a group. And that's more so than in the forest. In the forest, even though these monkeys or these early humanoids, they were arboreal, they may have lived in groups, as our apes today typically do, but they were not very collaborative. You know, everybody fed themselves, right? They go out, you know, going for fruit and they eat what they find, right? They don't share. They don't bring the fruit back to the group and then here, have some. They don't. I mean, it's very rare. I mean, even the people who are observing animal behavior, ethologists, they are called, it's rare that even very intelligent apes like chimpanzees share food. Their instinct is what I find, I eat it. And it makes a lot of sense in a place where you have ample food everywhere, and all it takes is each of them goes in a different direction in a different tree, and they get, you know, and find their food. And if there's one particularly good tree that has a lot of fruit, it will probably feed all of them anyway. So they may all sit in the same tree, but they just all eat at the same time. It's just like when you in your grandmother's garden went to your cherry tree. There's so many cherries. You can have 5 children all eat, you know, and stuff their stomach, and you will never run out of cherries, right? So that's the kind of monkey or ape kind of, or early humanoid, arboreal humanoid kind of lifestyle, right? And so you don't share. And you can't keep the fruits for very long. Yeah? They quickly turn bad. You just eat them as you find them, right? So humans shared their food because they hunted together, as do lions, right? So they're hunting in pack, or wolves, right? So the hunting in packs or in a pride, we can observe in some of those predators today, or in the water, you have like orcas, so they hunt in a group and then they feed off the killed prey together, right? There may be some kind of a rank order who gets to eat first, you know, but basically everybody gets to eat. Right? So they share their kill. So that made for a very strong social community. So these early humanoids who went into savannah maybe 2,500 years ago or so, they were social animals from the start. And that is the other element, in addition to their dexterity and their hunting skill and their, you know, use of tools and weapons. In addition to that, it was that social group that Ardrey argues gave a huge push to our brain. Right? Because a lot of what we do with our brain is communication, right? and socializing. And so all of these things came together. You know, we probably developed a primitive language early on, right? And all of that came together in the savannah in Africa. That's basically, and it made us who we are today, right? And we didn't stop hunting until, you know, 10,000 years ago. And even then, even when we had invented or discovered agriculture, we were starting to systematically tend for our fields and our plants. That didn't happen everywhere at the same time. Even, you know, until fairly recently, there have been still some hunting societies. Even today, in a few rainforests, for example, there are still hunting societies. Or in some far remote places in Africa, there are still hunting societies today. Now, you don't make the mistake of saying, oh, then we can study them and then we know exactly how those early hunting societies work. No, that's probably not the case, right? So we have to be careful there. But, you know, hunting became the core of our social behavior for most of our history until very recently. And it made even Cro-Magnon, meaning our modern humans that we are, that appeared about 45,000 years ago or so, were hunters, very skillful hunters. So were the Neanderthals, who were for a while their contemporaries, and the Neanderthals died out because Cro-Magnon was just simply outcompeting them probably. But even Neanderthal was an excellent hunter, right? And had a sizable brain. In fact, their brain was on average about the same size as ours. But it was differently developed. So it's not just a matter of size. Ours is just better, more effective, but not because it's bigger, yeah? But because it's wired differently. Okay, but Neanderthal was intelligent and was an excellent hunter. And there were predecessors to both Homo sapiens sapiens and to Homo neanderthalensis, who were already excellent and very intelligent hunters. So there's a long history, hundreds of thousands of years of hunting. Okay. Now, I just tell that story because you were wondering maybe what is this hunting hypothesis about. So it gives you a bit of a history of humankind, or a prehistory of humankind. Now, what I copied here is, so Adri understood that climate change was important in our development. He's a bit confused about what he wants to have, I think. But it's interesting what he says. The Pliocene was in itself a natural wonder. It was that period of geological time following the abundant, though dwindling, Miocene and preceding the present Pleistocene, our time of unpredictable climate swings between devouring continental ice sheets and such breathing spells we enjoy today. Okay, let's full stop there first. So what he's saying, the Pliocene was the period when the savanna expanded and the forest shrunk. So before the Pliocene was the Miocene. The Miocene was that warm period I talked about last time. Well, it was at the end of that very warm period where I said probably the maximum biomass was achieved on Earth, right? Because very warm temperatures, greenhouse effect, they call it, right? And optimal conditions for many, many plants as well as many, many animals, right? So that was the Miocene. So in the Miocene, our ancestors were arboreal, living in the forest, happily gathering fruit every day, without too many sorrows, probably, quite a happy, paradisical lifestyle, quite easy. Climate was stable. Their populations were stable. Their ecosystem was stable. Wow. Right, that was the Miocene. It was followed by the Pliocene, and the Pliocene is that period in which temperatures cooled and the savanna expanded. Okay, so that is critical for our human evolution because it was the shift from the warm climate of the Miocene to the cooler climate of the Pliocene that made us go into the savanna, become upright, become hunters, use weapons, become social, and develop our brain. You got it? All of that happened in the Pliocene, so in this cooling period. A long drawn, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, long drawn period during which we became highly efficient hunters. Okay? And so this Pliocene precedes the current Pleistocene, which is the period we are in right now, which is defined by a very unstable climate. He calls it unpredictable climate, swings between continental ice sheets and short, what he calls breathing spells, where the temperatures are comfortable, like we have right now. So he's basically saying we are in an interglacial period between two ice ages. The next ice age is sure to come. And the last ice age is not that long ago. And this unpredictability of climate is probably going to stay with us for some time. Right? So we are currently, and we have been now for some time, been living in a period of rapid climate changes up and down, up and down. He calls it unpredictable. Okay, just to be clear what he's talking about. Okay, second sentence here. Optimistic textbooks may label today's brief respite the Holocene as if our troubles with glaciers were over. So the latest period that we're in right now is also, which is in a way it's a subset of the Pleistocene, is also called Holocene. And it's just the last period since the last ice age, I believe. We'll see it on the next page, which has been, again, relatively stable temperatures at a comfortable level. So what we're experiencing right now, that climate. And he's saying, yeah, we optimistically refer to this as a Holocene, as if this is a new age of luxury because temperatures are so nice. But he says, no, I don't think so. This is now fortune telling, right? He doesn't, of course, know the future any more than we do, but he says he doesn't believe that we are in any kind of longish, stable period that even deserves its own name, Holocene. Rather, he says we are still in that Pleistocene period of significant climate swings. And we are just happening right now to be between swings. So it looks very comfortable, but it will not last. Right? He says, again, last sentence, so as if our troubles with glaciers were over. They are not. Our planet's weather has been deteriorating since the time of the Ramapithecines, early humans, and presumably we have not seen the end of it. The Ramapithecines were early in that Pleistocene, I think, or even in the Pliocene. So they're early humans. And he says, ever since then, 1.5 million years ago, if I remember correctly, climate has been unpredictable, and there's no reason to believe it's changed. That's basically its story. Right. So Robert Ardrey in 1976 says we should be worried about the next ice age. Isn't it funny? He was in 1976, 45 years ago, he was worried about the next ice age. And he said they come very quickly and we have no idea when it will come. But when it comes, it will probably be really quick and really harsh and really cold. And he says our whole lifestyle today is so dependent on this warm temperature that we better watch out, right? It could happen within centuries, basically, he said. Now, I told you last time I had a chart where I said until the early or mid-70s, the number, if you recall, the number of reports published on global cooling outnumbered or equaled the number of reports on global warming. So the book appeared just on the cusp of the point at which researchers, climate researchers, started to taking global warming more seriously than global cooling. So he's just at the end of a period where people were much more worried about cooling than warming. Yeah. And he underestimates perhaps, I mean, when you read some of the passages in the book, he says, oh, CO2 output is going to be stable and there's no, I mean, so temperature rise, yes, may be the case, but very slow. So even in 100 years or in 50 years, he says, we will not really have increased the global temperature by more than like half a degree or so. He eyeballed that back of the envelope. It probably wasn't too far off, but I think he didn't imagine that the population in 1976 may have been 2.5 or 3 billion humans. Today it's 8, right? Almost 8. More than double, right? Far more than double. And what he didn't maybe anticipate is that human population would continue exploding at that speed. Or he assumed that our consumption of CO2 would just trend down and down and down per capita consumption, right? So even if the population increases, then the overall effect would be maybe flat. And if it remains flat, he calculated, then temperature rise will be maybe 0.5 degrees Celsius. And he said, no big deal. So he said, we don't need to worry about global warming so much. We need to be worried about the next ice age, because an ice age can be tremendous in its impact on climate and on humans. So I just thought I share that because it's really interesting, right? Here today, everybody is like, oh, global warming, global warming, global warming. But only 45 years ago, intelligent people were talking about global cooling being the bigger threat. Now, if we are totally lucky, the next ice age will come and we will have warmed the earth by a few degrees with our industry, and they offset each other to some degree. That'd be wonderful. Now, of course, you may say, yeah, but the global warming we now know is happening, and yeah, it is. And it's happening more steeply than Mr. Ardrey had anticipated. And whereas whether the next ice age is around the corner or not, we don't know, right? It may be thousands of years off, correct? Right? So I'm just half joking when I say, oh, maybe those two effects could offset each other. Wouldn't it be wonderful? But I think the more serious point is that it never pays to be too hung up on one theory at the expense of all the other possibilities, right? And just as he was probably too hung up on his ice age because he had studied the ice ages very carefully and he had realized they had a big impact on humanity. And again, I'll talk about that because it's interesting. And so the ice age, that's the big challenge. And today, of course, we say, well, at the moment we have something more pressing, which is global warming, which is happening right before our eyes, right? Versus with the ice age, we have no clue how long that may take, if ever, right? So of course it's rational to shift focus more on the the immediate challenge of warming rather than cooling, right? So I agree with that, of course. It's rational to focus more on warming. But what I'm saying is there's no point to be hysterical about it, right? There's no point in thinking about nothing else, as if there is nothing else. There is plenty of other things going on. And, global warming is probably not the biggest of our problems. I mean, as I keep saying, I think global stupidity is our biggest problem. But nobody talks about global stupidity, even though it's an evident fact, right? That the whole humanity has gone stupid. So that's in my view, is a much bigger problem than global warming, but nobody talks about it, right? So let's not be hung up on one thing or the other. And that includes me. I don't want to be too hung up on one thing either, but let's look at many things can happen and we don't know the future. Yes, we may want to be cautious and say, okay, global warming, it's happening, and there's certain things we can do, and they're not too expensive, and they're manageable. And instead of just wait and do nothing, let's anticipate and do something. I don't really object to that, yeah? But it has to be a sober assessment of the cost and the benefits, right? The reason I'm so jittery about it is because in the last 2 years around COVID, we have absolutely not done that at all, right? The cost of what we're doing outweigh the benefits by several orders of magnitude. Right? So it couldn't be more stupid than that. Right? So all I'm saying is, please, let's not do that again. Let's be balanced and measured. And yes, maybe, if everybody wants to have an electric car, okay. Keep in mind that every electric car is stuffed full with batteries, and that batteries are full with rare earths. And someone sent me a video about cobalt being produced in Africa at incredibly negative working conditions, etc. And all the batteries right now need cobalt. Of course, there may be technology advances. Maybe we can we can produce batteries without cobalt or with less cobalt. And I'm sure that's ongoing because cobalt is getting increasingly rare and expensive. And there are only 2 African countries, apparently, that account for most of the production at the moment, or the mining of it. So I'm just bringing that up because it just happened to come across my desk. But the point is, and I made it last time, whenever we talk about sustainable and green and clean, oh my gosh, I get like my hair goes up like this, right? Because never do these people who use these words think about, well, how green and clean is it really, right? I mean, nobody's talking about, well, I think some experts maybe are somewhere, but not many people in public are talking about how are we, for example, going to recycle or get rid of millions and millions and millions of car batteries, they are not like the batteries we have today in our cars, those little boxes that just ignite the car. No, they are like huge, complex, intricate batteries with a lot of interesting, sometimes poisonous materials in them that have to be taken care of when the battery is dead. Yeah, it will have a life like any engine, or it will have a lifespan, and at some point it will have to be recycled or disposed of, right? And nobody seems to be worried about that. It's like, oh, let's solve one problem, and if we create a new problem, we'll solve that later. Yeah, to some degree, sometimes that has to be the case because we cannot anticipate all problems and we cannot solve all problems at once. I don't mean to make it too complicated, but sometimes it's just way too simplistic. Oh, if everybody drives an electric car, then we've saved the planet. No. We will have done none of that. We may have made things worse. Yeah. So okay. So Robert Ardrey, and so the other page I brought Actually, I had it last time, I brought it back. Is this one, remember, because I just wanted to talk again about the terminology. So on the previous slide, Adri was talking about the Miocene, right? And I said, that's, you know, the tail end of the warm period. That's here, see? Temperatures like 5 degrees higher on average than today. And coming out of that Eocene, where I said that was the global optimum, where probably the richest in terms of just quantity at least, and maybe also diversity, the richest life existed on Earth because it was just very warm and comfy. So the Miocene was already cooling, but in the Miocene, our ancestors were still living in the trees happily. Remember, I talked about we split off Pan, meaning chimpanzees, about 7 to 8 million years ago. So that's roughly, apparently, where the Miocene turned into Pliocene, right? Now, after that split from chimpanzees, we may not have immediately gone into the savanna, right? It may have still taken hundreds of thousands of years, but eventually into this Pliocene area, we started going into the savanna. You know? Now, Lucy is found, Lucy is a famous skeleton of an Australopithecus. It's not a Homo, not considered Homo, it's a predecessor of Homo, not yet part of the Homo species, the Australopithecus, but already like the half monkey, half man, like not really upright, hunched, long arms hanging down, but already quite dexterous with the hands, and already to a significant degree living in the savanna, yeah, or at the edge between forest and savanna. So Lucy is sort of an early step into the Homo world, right? Okay, and then so our friend Adri was talking about the Pliocene, and here the Pliocene was still very comfortable, but then came a temperature at about today's temperature, actually around, you know, plus minus 0, what we have here in the mid-Pliocene. There comes a temperature at which maybe really the savanna has expanded significantly and the forests have receded. Maybe the forests at that point were not much bigger than they are today, rainforests, right? Maybe they cover 5 to 10% of the world's land surface or so, right? And maybe at that time it was a bit like that. So the apes and the early hominids who were still arboreal had already been reduced into ever smaller ecosystems, right? And somewhere here in the middle, I don't know when, somewhere around Lucy, our predecessors started to really live predominantly in the savanna and learn to do that, right? Lucy already had simple tools and weapons. Yeah, and then that continued for a long time until about, I don't know, 800,000 years ago or so, when the first ice age, so the temperatures continued dropping, right? So by about 1 million years ago, you can see they were already -2, -3 of what they are today. So 2 or 3 degrees cooler on average worldwide than today, right? So that's already quite significant. Yeah? But still livable. I mean, in Europe, the temperatures are also several degrees lower than near the equator, right? And people can live in Europe, right? So it's livable, but it's already getting pretty cool, right? And then the first ice age happened here, where 800,000 years ago, so where the temperatures really dropped deep. And then you have that beginning of that period that Adri was talking about on the previous slide, of that instability, right? Up and down. So temperature reaches something like today, comfortable, and then down again, cold, -5, compared on average, 5 degrees colder than today, and up and down and up and down. And then about 50,000 years ago, and in the meantime, Homo sapiens came about, not yet Homo sapiens sapiens, it's not yet us, we are like Cro-Magnon, right? That comes later, but an earlier version of us, Neanderthal came along, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo whatnot, right? There are quite a few, but there are some of them are already categorized as Homo sapiens, right? So quite similar to modern man, right? When you see a skeleton of a early Homo sapiens, it is quite similar to ours. The overall size is quite similar, and the overall proportions, of the skeleton, the arms, the legs, similar, or upright walk, right? Relatively large brain, a bit smaller than ours maybe, but large. Now they, for example, what they still have is this thick eye ridge, which you also have in the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals survived until about 40,000 years ago, and they had a much more thick, brow ridge here in the skull. So that's one of the things that Cro-Magnon doesn't have, right? But this early Homo sapiens already had a chin. The relevance of the chin is tremendous. Maybe I hadn't realized that until I looked it up. You may have noticed most animals have a sort of like a snout. Even modern apes, they don't. We are the only ones who have a really flat face like that, right? Most other animals have a snout. Some, if you look at a dog or even a fox, is extreme. It's like a very long snout. If you look at a chimpanzee, it's only like some degree of snout, right? Going forward, but not too much, right? Now, the significance of that is actually really interesting. In order to have the ability to bite hard things and exert power onto your jaw, right? Our jaw is extremely powerful, and many animals, even some animals, even more powerful than ours, right? But the jaws to bite and crunch and reduce things that we eat, and to some degree, in many animals as a weapon, remember, they use the snout to bite, right, as a weapon, has to be extremely powerful. Now, the long snout is a very elegant solution that evolution has discovered for having an extremely efficient bite. Because just the mechanics, the engineering of it is such that you don't need, the animal that has a long snout doesn't need a very thick lower jaw, like the thickness of the bone, it can be quite fine and light. And the muscles that contract and open the mouth or the snout don't have to be all that powerful, because just of the design, there's this effect of leverage, right? The longer your snout, the more leverage you get at the front of the snout. Imagine that's basic mechanical physics, I think. So so the longer the snout, the more power the animal can exert onto a certain area of their teeth, of their jaw, without needing huge bone structures and thick muscles. So it's very efficient, that's the point. The snout design is very efficient. Now, hominoids never had a very long snout, right? But they did have a snout. And as I said, even chimpanzees today, you look at them, they have a snout, right? It's efficient. We don't. We don't have a snout. And the reason we are able to chew properly without a snout is because we developed a chin. The chin is a bone structure here that sort of goes forward and allows the muscles to be attached very far in the front rather than further back. If you imagine, if you have a receding chin, like even the Neanderthal men still had a receding chin, the place where the muscles are attached will be much further back relative to your front teeth, right? But with our chin, the chin is literally on the same level as our front teeth, right? And so the muscles that sort of operate our lower jaw, they can be attached all the way to the chin and then back here. So we've replaced the snout with a different leverage mechanism, basically. And that leverage mechanism is the chin. It's a bone structure that only Homo sapiens ever developed, as far as we know. We have never found any other skeleton that is not a Homo sapiens. So that's almost one of the defining elements of Homo sapiens, is a chin. Right? So already those 300,000-year-olds had a chin. So even Neanderthal, as I said, they were part of this, already had a primitive chin, but not a very pronounced one. Only Cro-Magnon, us, Homo sapiens sapiens, only we have this pronounced chin. And that allows us to have a good bite without exerting unnecessary power. So our muscular structure is quite lean. And most importantly, our bone structure is lean. And it's shifted, if you like, our face and our jaw, that whole structure, a little bit down, and make room up here for the frontal lobes of our brain. So the whole engineering of our skull, it allowed more space in the skull. And partially thanks to the chin. I know that's quite incredible. So I hope I'm explaining it well, because I'm not an expert on chins, on anatomy at all. I just read it up, right? Because I was curious. But you can read it up yourself. And if I made some mistake or was imprecise, so forgive me. But this is extraordinary. To me, that was quite an eye-opener. I had not realized how important the chin is. Yeah, it allows us to have a functioning jaw and facial features, and yet a big skull up here with a lot of space for brain. And most importantly, a lot of our brain is in the frontal lobe and in the forward part. Compare that to a Neanderthal. As I said, the Neanderthal is roughly the same size of brain as us, but a lot of it is in the back. It doesn't have the big frontal lobes that we have, and it has more stuff in the back. And scientists believe that the more primitive parts of what they needed to have is in the back. They didn't have this brainy part that we need for smartness, basically. In other words, Neanderthal was not as smart as Cro-Magnon. And one of the reasons Cro-Magnon outsmart them is because we have a more pronounced chin. That is pretty extraordinary. Actually, we so outcompeted Neanderthal that unfortunately they're gone. We probably drove them into extinction. We don't know for sure. There are other theories what happened to them, but I think the most prominent and most widely supported theory or hypothesis is that us, Cro-Magnon, literally drove them into extinction because we outcompeted them. We competed with them for the same prey. We had a very similar hunting lifestyle to them, and we were just smarter. We had the better weapons, we had the better group dynamics, the better tactics, right? And the reason we had all of those is this, right here. And the reason we had this is here. Brilliant. So you can see how nature works. It all hangs together somehow, but sometimes it's quite mysterious until we kind of figure it out. Then, of course, there may be many other things that went on, right? It's not just the chin, right? But the chin was important, and my point was just early Homo sapiens, they did still have fat eye ridges, and maybe also their head was still more like to the back, like Neanderthal was one of them, right? And the brain was more pushed to the back, and they didn't have these frontal lobes, right? And they had only maybe an emerging chin, not yet the really pronounced chin that Cro-Magnon man has. But they were recognizably Homo sapiens, and that's why they're called and categorized as Homo sapiens. There's some debate whether Neanderthals should be considered part of Homo sapiens or a separate branch. I can't say anything about that debate. It's a bit like, should Pluto be the 9th planet, or is it not a planet, or is it a dwarf planet? And our astronomers will probably debate that for many thousands of years to come, because it's just a question of definition, right? You use a certain definition, and then it's either on this side of the definition or on the other side, right? So I consider, at the moment, I consider Neanderthal men as Homo. Yeah. And even as a Homo, as a form of Homo sapiens. I'm sorry, not just Homo, but Homo sapiens. Yeah, I do, but that's arbitrary, right? Doesn't really matter. 130,000 years ago, remember, we came out of Africa. That may have been during a relatively warm period, but I'm not sure. But then came really some fantastically cold ice ages, and the temperatures went down to -7, -8 degrees less global average compared to today. That's tremendous. That's really cold. And during those times, the ice shelf expanded massively, and you in the northern and southern hemisphere, you had big chunks of Europe and North America, for example, covered in ice, right? Which has lots of implications. I mean, it completely takes like huge land areas away that cannot be longer used for living, right? So it reduces available land area in those areas. At the same time, it draws a lot of water out of the ocean and into the ice, and the ocean surface was much lower than today. Therefore, in other parts of the world, there was additional land available. I don't even know what's the net, whether we had net more land or net, I mean, surface land, or net less than we have today, right? Because those two effects to some degree cancel each other out. But you can imagine it had huge impact on where humans could live and what animals were able to survive. So these last ice ages, this is the time of the the mammoths, the woolly mammoths with long hair, right? You've seen the pictures, right? Or the woolly rhino that had like a thick coat as well with hair, and early small horses and so on, right? Bottom line is, for a hunter, more than for a gatherer, but for a hunter, this was not such a bad time, because quite a lot of plant eaters, like the mammoths and the rhino and so on, and the primitive horse and the our ox and so on, they could live with this harsh climate quite well. So if you think about North America about 100 years ago, huge bison herds in the prairies, in the middle of the North American continent, which were then decimated within a matter of 1 or 2 decades by humans who just killed them. But there were huge herds of bisons with possibly millions of members in a single herd. Huge. That kind of herds could have existed during this ice age in some parts, in what's now southern Europe and northern Africa, and some other parts. So it wasn't such a bad time for a hunter. And it was a matter of being more competitive than other predators. So there was hunting animals out there, but there were, of course, wolves and bears and lions and so on, and Neanderthal men. And so it was a matter of being the more competitive hunter. Only the toughest survived the ice ages. And guess who was the toughest of them all? Homo sapiens, that's right. And specifically, Cro-Magnon. Us, modern men. We emerged about 45,000 years ago, meaning at the peak, if you like, of the last, not the last ice age. There were more ice ages since, but the coldest of them all, the mother of all ice ages, that's when we emerged. So we are children of ice age, right? However, once we had outcompeted Neanderthal, which happened within 5,000 years or so of us appearing on the stage. It didn't take very long for us to completely eradicate Neanderthal men, literally everywhere. Now, there are some more recent Neanderthal bones that have been found, as recent as 20,000 years ago. So they may or may not be Neanderthal, because often they only find a little fragment, like a little piece of a jaw bone, or something like that, or some one piece of a skull or some upper arm bone, right? And it's not always easy to determine what species it represents, right? So I think we have to be cautious, but there may have been surviving Neanderthal men until, in Spain, they think maybe until about 30 or 35,000 years ago. So they may have survived the arrival of Cro-Magnon by 10,000 years. And somewhere in Siberia, maybe even even more recent. Yeah. So we don't need to speculate about that. So I think we can say in the main, Neanderthal was extinguished by Cro-Magnon fairly quickly, within a matter of maybe just 5,000 years or so. But maybe not everywhere. Maybe there were some pockets of Neanderthal surviving quite a lot longer because they were isolated and they didn't have this competition, right? But be that as it may, at some point they were gone, right? So during that time of Cro-Magnon, there were still a couple of really cold periods. But it was during those cold periods that, you know, the horse and the other artifacts, especially those wonderful cave paintings, came about. So I think what we can relatively confidently say is that Cro-Magnon ourselves, we are extremely efficiently adapted to this changeable climate that Audrey was talking about on the previous slide, right? He says, oh, it's been terrible weather. But actually, that's why I said he's a bit confused about what he's saying. Actually, it has served us very well because we are more competitive in this fluctuating climate than almost any other predator. In fact, probably than any other predator. Maybe white shark or so is also very efficient, I don't know, in the oceans. But, you know, there are very few predators who have done so well during this fluctuating period of the last, 30,000 years, since the horse came about, that I showed you on the front page. This fluctuating, climate that gets a bit warmer, then it gets cold again, then it gets warmer, then it gets cold again. We have done well in this climate that Audrey said was very unpredictable. And I think it's very logical. In an unpredictable environment, a good brain and a flexible way of thinking is a wonder weapon. See, if the climate was stable all the way through, there would be no pressure, no evolutionary pressure on our brain to continue evolving. Because, the climate is stable. Our lifestyle is stable. We have proven ourselves in a certain lifestyle, a certain either hunting or gathering or whatever, whatever it is. We've found an ecological niche in which we can survive happily. Maybe our population won't expand, but it will not significantly shrink either. It will be stable and happy and, comfortable, right? It is only these great fluctuations in climate, especially in the last, 50,000 or maybe 100,000 years, that gave us that evolutionary pressure that brought our fantastic brain, our beautiful chin and everything else to the fore, and that made us the most competitive of all predators. Even more competitive than Neanderthal. Even though Neanderthal had been around for much longer, they were slightly bigger perhaps or heavier than us. They not bigger, not taller, but bonier and more muscular perhaps, because if you're very bony, you probably also have bigger muscles. So they were very good hunters. They were very well adapted to a certain lifestyle, but we outcompeted them. And we outcompeted them especially in that period, which was quite fluctuating, because our greater intellect allowed us to deal with that fluctuation. We learned to cook, which means that if meat was scarce, because maybe the meat supply is seasonal, right? In summer you have plenty, in winter you have very little. Yeah, we learned to cook. We learned to cook to preserve the meat. We learned to cook to break open those grains and start eating some of those, wild grains. We were already eating nuts. Even our ancient predecessors were eating nuts because we can digest nuts well and they're nutritious. But those grains were tougher, and only Cro-Magnon really figured out how to boil grains and legumes and all this wonderful wild. Relatively high calorie plant material that you can only really digest well if you cook it, right? So we learned to cook. We used fire, of course, regularly to keep ourselves warm. Neanderthal men also did. So that was not really an advantage. But somehow we adopted cooking. Neanderthal never really apparently adopted cooking, not in a significant way. They may have occasionally cooked something. You know, it happens. You have a piece of meat. You're sitting by the fire. You eat a piece of raw meat. It drops into the fire, and oh, that smells good, right? And let me try that. Oh, that's actually quite good. And then you start cooking, you know, or grilling, barbecuing, right? So, I mean, I'm sure over all these tens of thousands of years that Neanderthal men also figured out that certain things are tasty when they're cooked, right? And certain things can be more easily eaten when they're cooked. But they never took to cooking as a regular craft. As far as I could see now, some of this research I looked at, such as Adri, is 45 years old. So mind you, right? If you want to know exactly what we know today about Neanderthal men, please look it up, right? I haven't, right? So some of these data that I'm sharing here may already be outdated because we found new things. But from what I saw there, Neanderthal didn't really cook, but Cro-Magnon did, right? It's just one example of what we learned to do under tough circumstances. But in those tough circumstances, we learned new tricks. We were very innovative, and we out-innovated everybody else, including our close relative Neanderthal men, and also including most animals, most predators. And so we prospered, right? And that's why that is the period in which we did those wonderful cave paintings, and you know, those wonderful horses and little figures, and you know, those bountiful Venuses, you know, those Venus figures of pregnant women, probably fertility symbols or goddesses, right? Because of course, when man became conscious, one of the things they became conscious of is like the wonder of, you know, childbirth, right? And the wonder of the woman who is fertile and pregnant and then delivers the baby, right? They will have been awed by that female capacity, right? And the reason we have so many, relatively speaking, many Venus figures over periods of like more than 10 or 15,000 years, we have Venus figures, is that again and again, men, and probably literally men, human, but also, you know, male human, marveled at women, right? And adored their fertile power, as well as adoring them sexually, probably. We can talk about that as well. It's another invention of humans, is sex. Animals don't really have sex the way we do, right? Most animals have an annual cycle of menstruation, or estrus, it's called for females. They are only able to be pregnant within a short window of time, and the male comes and does the thing, and it's all very loveless. Female animals that don't apparently enjoy orgasm, I'm sorry, only humans do. So Audrey talks about that as well. It's very interesting that females invented orgasm. Males also have orgasm, but it's more mechanical, right? It's like fire and forget. Women have an orgasm. There's no organical reason for an orgasm. For the male, you may say, yeah, in order to eject our ejaculate, we need like an impetus, and you need to get sort of our nerves and our hormones and everything needs to get sort of lined up and excited so that we can fire, right? But for the woman, there's no obvious reason why a female should have forgot my train of thought. Orgasm, sorry, should have an orgasm. There's no immediate reason for that. So the only plausible reason is for of course, pleasure. It's pleasurable, period. But it's attractive for males as well. And so the combination of the monthly period and female orgasm meant that men would be going after women, or vice versa. I don't mean to make this very sexist, because the women may well have been the ones who, you know, played the sexy thing. so that the men would come, right? So it's both ways, right? I don't mean to give priority to one of the genders here. The females learned to whack their hips in such a way that the men couldn't resist, and the men learned to go after them all year round, right? And what Audrey discusses in his book is quite interesting. He says that allowed, so he said, because of our very long gestation periods, 9 months the woman is pregnant, and then the children take several years of looking after them until they are big enough to more or less fend for themselves, right? And in fact, back then, maybe when they were 8 or 9 or 10, right? I mean, nowadays they're 18, and even then they still need money for university. Yeah, but so they needed many years to grow up to a point where they could fend for themselves, much longer than almost any animal we can think of. So it's a very long period in which, and then they became pregnant again, and the round starts again. So he says quite plausibly, in this group, in these early human groups, very likely the males would be the hunters. They would go out and hunt, and they would hunt, as I said, in a group, 5 to 10 people maybe, for an efficient hunt. And they would leave their women behind. The women would be in charge of protecting the children and protecting their little abode, whether it was a cave or there are some very early house structures have been found. So we may have built a hut earlier than maybe we thought, but it doesn't matter. Wherever they had made their home, the females quite early on in our history were probably in charge of defending the home. The home is my castle, right? Or the castle, the Brits say, right? That was a female role while the males went out hunt. And depending on how efficient they were in hunting, and that may have been, subject to seasonal variations, etc., they may have been gone on a hunting party for several days, leaving the women behind. Audrey argues that's why in humans, the difference in size between the male and the female is not very big compared to, for example, some of the apes, where the difference is substantially bigger, the female being much smaller than the male. And he argues, if you live in an arboreal lifestyle and you just collect fruit, then there is no big advantage for the female to be bigger. She doesn't have to defend herself. She just has to be a quick climber. There's no advantage for her pregnancy to be bigger, apparently. For the male, the reason they may be bigger is because they fight each other. And they build a harem, and to defend your harem, you better be like the so-called silverback among the gorillas, right? Like really big. It makes good sense if you have a harem structure for the male to be really big to fend off other males. So he's not so much fending off enemies, sometimes maybe other predators, yes, that may be part of it, but primarily he's fending off other males, other of his own species, right? Who could be raiding his women. Right? So in apes, you see quite a big difference. Depends on the ape, not all of them the same, but and I'm generalizing here a bit. And again, forgive me if I say something that may not be exactly right. And some expert may say, wait, Matthias, it's not quite like that. It's a bit different. Okay, fine. Fine. Yeah, just as a picture. Humans, male and female, are similar in size. And Audrey says that makes sense if you consider that sometimes the women would have been left behind alone without any males, or maybe just some of the young males who are not quite ready yet to go hunting. Because if you go out hunting, you don't want to have someone who is lame or very old or very young and not yet trained, right? Because they will hold you back, right? If you're on the hunt, you have to be fast and furious and to the point, and you know what I mean. It's just like war, right? And you don't really want anybody slowing you down. So he argues quite plausibly there may have been some elderly males, insofar as they were still alive, and some very young ones who were not quite ready for the hunt yet, who would have been left behind in the camp together with the women, but predominantly it would have been women, including little babies, etc., and small children. That they were protecting. And they had to protect that camp, whatever shape, or that cave, from predators. Yeah, depending on where they were, they had lions and tigers and wolves and bears and the rest, right? So the women were quite capable in defending themselves. They were not as capable in hunting as the males. The males were faster, stronger, right? But they were strong enough to fend off some predators and protect the children. And that, I think, is at the root of the structure that we've had until very recently. If you think about men going out and earning the money and the woman staying at home and having the house. I think there's a long tradition of that goes back tens of thousands of years, and it's linked to that hunting lifestyle. And it's linked to the fact that the males, in order to have a really successful hunt, would typically go in a big group. So most of the males would go together, because the more of them, to a limit, of course, but the more of them, the more likely they would be able to encircle and then catch rich prey. So they would not like to leave able-bodied males in their prime behind. They might have done sometimes if they felt that the women were in danger. There were some predators known to be in the neighborhood. They may have kept a couple of the able-bodied, males behind for additional protection. They may have, of course, but they would prefer not to, right? So the women, let's say in normal circumstances where there's not too much danger, to be able to defend themselves would have been a real plus, right? And so Audrey says that's probably why the women are almost the same size as males, unlike in some of our relative species like some of the apes, where it's different. The other thing he said, and that's back to our sexuality, he said, because the men knew when they come back, the women will welcome them, and including perhaps sexually welcome them. They would be hot for them, not all of them at the same time, but because of that, they felt emboldened to go out, spend a few days hunting, or even a week, or even 2 weeks, right? Whatever it took to really find those elusive animals, prey that were big enough to really support the calorie intake that they needed, right? They would potentially be gone for days, if not even 1 or 2 weeks at a time, and then return. They didn't need to worry about competing with each other for the rare woman who might just, it so happens, be an estrus, because all of them would be basically available to them, right? So every one of the hunters could look forward to coming home and finding a girl if you wanted, right? And likewise the girls, right? The girls were ready for it, right? They were awaiting their warriors, their hunters coming home with, the meat, bring the meat, and then, okay, you did a good job. Come over into the corner of the cave, right? I'll have you. So I'm just reporting what Adri says, but I think it's quite interesting, right? It suggests that the community worked well because there was limited competition among the males for the females. Whether they were at that time largely hardwired, almost like married to a single woman, so each of them had their married woman, or whether they were more promiscuous and they would sort of mix and match and change, we don't really know, I think. Well, I'm sure there are some more recent studies on that, and you could look it up, but I don't know, right? It could be either. You could imagine that they already had some really substantial bonds between men and women, or that they were still quite like in a group and they would mix, freely, free sex, as they called it, the hippie movement, right? Either of them is possible, right? Because they were a strong community, even not knowing for the men, not knowing necessarily that they were the father may not have mattered if there were enough children to go around and they got their shot. They knew probabilistically some of those children would be theirs, right? So even that, in a tightly knit group, it could be wife sharing, if you like, or husband sharing. Or it could be one-on-one. Right? That I don't know. But it was a tight community in which males and females prospered, they did well, they did better. They out-competed everybody else. And that's how the cave paintings of Lascaux came about. So I've tried to tell you the story of those cave paintings. Yeah. And it starts with climate change. It starts here at the end of the Miocene, or in the course of the Miocene, temperatures dropping still above today's temperatures, still warm, but dropping. And at some point thereafter, leading to not only the split off between hominids and chimpanzees, the last sort of special split that we've experienced, but also the probably slow but steady shift from arboreal lifestyle in forests and rainforests that were shrinking because of the cooling temperatures, and maybe with the cooling temperatures also dryness, right, into a savanna lifestyle, right? And that shift into the savanna took maybe several millions of years. It wasn't quick. It was probably gradual. But at some point, I mean, 3 million years ago, we have Lucy, who is already in Australopithecus, so it's not yet a Homo, but it's already has features that we would recognize as our own, right? It's already quite distinct from a chimpanzee. It's like halfway. So, yeah, and not too late after that. Maybe, as I said earlier, maybe 2.5 million years ago or so. At some point, the first Homo, and people debate: is it Homo habilis, who was earlier, or is it Homo erectus, who was a bit later? So there's a debate among experts. Or at least when Audrey published his book 45 years ago, there was a debate, and it wasn't settled. Where exactly do we start this Homo, right? This our species. So it doesn't matter. There's a gradual shift towards man, right? And that shift happened. The key change happened during that Pliocene and then the earlier Pleistocene, when we left the forest and moved into the savanna. That was the founding era of modern man. And that is everything we are today is related to that shift into the savanna. And then we get the middle and late Pleistocene, where we have climate change, right? Where we have warm temperatures, cold temperatures, warm temperatures, cold temperatures. And that is the period in which Homo sapiens came about. And we came out of Africa.
Please stop.
And that is at the end of that period, Cro-Magnon. So we have a period of cooling that drove us out of the comfortable forest into the tough savanna and became the foundational environment for Homo. And then we have a period of a lot of climate change up and down that became the foundation for Cro-Magnon, who it is that we are today. And then,
you make me sick.
Then we have, in the last 20,000 years, we have a gradual warming. There are 2 more ice ages where we kind of outcompeted the Neanderthal. And then we get into the temperature range that we have today. And that's around about 12,000 years ago. And guess what? That is the period when we learn to become agriculturalists, because the warming drove off those animals we love to hunt. So the supply of, the mammoths died out at some point during that period. The woolly rhino died out, and many other species died out. So the animals, the aurochs died out eventually, maybe a bit later. But a lot of the animals you see on the cave paintings died out. And they died out because of warming, because they were perfectly adapted to cold temperatures. They were not so good in the warming. Humans ingenious as we were, we survived and prospered because we invented new things. We invented or discovered agriculture. So about 12,000 years, or maybe 10,000 years ago, the first agriculturalists came about in, modern Anatolia and Mesopotamia, perhaps in the highlands of northern Mesopotamia and what's now eastern Turkey, right? At least that's where I think we have found the oldest remains of agriculturalists. Now there may be even older ones that are yet to be discovered, or that will never be discovered because unfortunately their traces have gone forever. So we will see. But at the moment, that area is probably where the first agriculturalists settled down, and they really became settled, or at least partially settled, or semi-nomadic. And the invention of plant growing in a regular systematic way, in a seasonal kind of way with grains and so on, and the invention of herding, they may have coincided more or less at around the same time. So the same people who started to have some little fields, because the fields forced them to stay put, and they could no longer have their wandering nomadic lifestyle that they used to have as hunters. As hunters, they will have followed their prey, right? So if there are seasonal wanderings, like remember the buffaloes in the prairies of North America, they would roam around and the hunters would go after them, and they would have their tipi, their tent in which they could live, and that they could easily take down after like a few weeks of good hunting, and then they would move to another place, right? So they were mobile. But in the moment where you become an agriculturalist and a significant portion of your food intake is plant-based and you grow it, it's not something you gather in the forest like those ancient pre-hominids did. They just gathered fruits that they found, but rather it's plants that you consciously grow in a seasonal cycle. So you have to tend for your fields, you have to sow in the spring, and then you have to harvest in the autumn. Means you have to more or less be settled there. You have to look after your field, depends on what it is. Some fields need more looking after than others, right? But you cannot really be fully mobile. You may still have a partially nomadic lifestyle. It may be that part of the household tends for a little field, and the other part of the household of the community still does some hunting, or they do some herding, right? So they've started to domesticate the first animals, maybe some goats or so, or sheep, and they start having meat supply from their own domesticated herd rather than from hunting. Those things may have evolved alongside each other. You can imagine, oh, we are now settled, so we lose the benefit of the hunt because we may still be able to hunt during peak seasons, when hunting animals are, in rich supply, but for the rest of the year, the hunt doesn't yield very much. Right? There will still be the occasional opportunity to hunt something, but it will maybe only contribute 20 or 30% of our food intake, right? So then we have our agriculture, and that may become the mainstay, maybe contributing 50% of the protein. That still leaves maybe another 30%, where you say, well, either we do some herding, so we have some, we have some goat, we get milk, we get maybe cheese. I don't know when cheese was invented, but we get milk or milk derivatives, and the occasional slaughter gives us the occasional meal, right? A meat meal. And we do some gathering as well. If we live in an area where there's rich things to gather, we do a little bit of that. So they will have had like a mixed, rich diet, a more diverse diet than the hunters, yeah. Which probably went along with changes in our digestion and so on. But the more diverse diet, but a more settled lifestyle. And of course, from that then come first towns, then cities, and all the so-called civilizations that come with high concentration of humans, which are only really possible with agriculture. None of those big cities and empires would have been possible without agriculture, right? Because the hunting lifestyle, almost by definition, the way it works, so a small group and mobile. So no cities and no big concentration of people, because there's no hunting ground that can sustain a very large population in the same place, right? For very long. right? So it was during a period of relatively mild temperature and relatively stable temperatures of the last 12,000 years, in which we became agriculturalists and, if you like, civilizations as we are today. So there are 3 steps in human development that were all, in a way, dependent on climate. A cooling that drove us from the trees into the savanna. A very up and downy, climate changey, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm period here in the middle that evolved us into modern man, the way we are today with this big brain. And then in the last 12,000 years or so, and that period, if you like, peaked with those cave paintings in Lascaux, Altamira, and so on. So about 15, 20,000 years ago. So that's when that period peaked. And then after the last ice age, which is about, 12,000 years ago, when temperatures then warmed and since then have been fairly stable, that was the time in which we invented agriculture and became settled. And our populations just simply exploded. Yeah. So for that to happen, we needed a relatively mild and stable climate, but not very long time, only 12,000 years. Quite quick. Now, just to bring it back to climate change. So what I'm saying is humans have evolved only because of climate change. Without climate change, we would not exist, right? So climate change isn't anything bad. It's just like what I said about viruses. 8% of our DNA is viruses, and without viruses, you probably wouldn't exist either, right? So we have to move beyond seeing the devil in everything that is not familiar, right? Climate change is a constant, like any change. Change is a constant. We depend on climate change. We need climate change in a way, or at least up to now we have needed it, right? Now, not necessarily so quickly. What is now happening with the temperature rise, it's very quick, right? That may not be very useful for us. I agree, right? But let's think about it, right? But in general, climate change has propelled us because we can deal with it better than just about any other animal, at least large mammal. We just simply are good at dealing with climate change. Right? And if you say, yeah, but that's what we're doing, Matthias, we are now inventing new batteries for electric vehicles so that we will deal with climate change. It's just another wave of innovation. Yes, that may well be the case. No need for hysteria. No need to bombard us with more laws and regulations and limitations to who we are, right? Yes, innovation, wonderful. Let the innovation flow. And let's let it compete and let's see what actually works, right? But don't be scared of climate change. It's been absolutely necessary in our history. And the great news from this is we did well when it was cooling. We did well when it was up and downy, zigzaggy. And we did well when it was stable and fairly warm. So we've done well under any of those scenarios. Now you could argue, well, we say that in retrospect and we were lucky, but it could have gone otherwise. Yes, that's true. If during the up and downy period, for example, we could have died out, we wouldn't be here today to have this discussion. That's true. So to celebrate and say, oh, look how great we did, that's a bit anthropocentric, if you like, because it may just have been, to some degree, just luck, right? We are lucky enough to be here today to tell the tale, right? And it could have been otherwise. Maybe when the first Cro-Magnon appeared on the stage, if Neanderthal had been a bit quicker, maybe Neanderthal would have exterminated us, right? Before we even got, anywhere big. They didn't, but it could have gone otherwise. Yeah. So we cannot just simply take things for granted and, oh, we've been doing so well in any kind of climate in the past, so therefore we will do in any kind of climate in the future. I wouldn't go that far, right? But on the other hand, we should at least, recognize from our history, we've done extremely well under very diverse climates. We came out of forests that were at least degrees warmer than what we have today. And we went into ice ages that were at least 7 or 8 degrees colder than what we have today. And we survived all of that and everything in between. Okay. And I said that before, today's temperature on this chart, it looks like it's like an average, right? It's like the 0 line. It looks almost like, oh, that's sort of the average over this period. But I showed you last time that if you go back 550 million years or so, this time scale is only after the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, right? The 64 million years or so. But remember, I had a chart with a time scale that goes back to like 500 million years ago or so. The average temperature was actually warmer than this 0 line. It was maybe where the +5 is, you know. Yeah. So remember, I said we are actually just coming out of the fridge, the ice, the igloo, and we are just now going into a temperate zone in terms of our temperatures. And even if temperatures rise by an average of 2.5 or 3 or 4 degrees, it just takes us back to the long-term average. So again, don't panic. We don't need to save the planet. The planet has been there before. The planet can handle it. Can we handle it? Yes, I think we probably can, but let's be a little bit sort of relaxed about it, yeah? And not go hysterical about it. Even if you say, yeah, but everything good, Matthias, but we've never had such rapid increase in temperature. And even that may not be true, because if you look at some of those spikes, and I talked about that spike between the Paleocene and the Eocene last time, you know, that spiky thingy there where the temperatures were like 15 degrees, for a brief period, were 15 degrees warmer than now. Audrey talks about that a little bit in his book, and he says, no, these spikes may have been quite quick. Maybe only hundreds of years, and that's what we're talking about here, right? I mean, we're talking about the next 100 or 200 years, significant warming, yeah, but that's actually maybe not spikier than what the Earth has already experienced in the past. Yeah, it is spiky for sure, but not spiky to the degree that it would be unprecedented. Not even unprecedented during maybe human existence, right? If you look at those spikes down there, hard to tell from the time scale, right? We probably don't know exactly how spiky it was, but you see, I mean, rapid temperature rise and rapid temperature drop, either because of some asteroid or some, you know, volcano, or, you know, that kind of external factor, or some other, something changes, Earth's magnetic field changes every so often, remember, right? And that may have a significant climate impact. So there are lots of things that can drive a climate change in a relatively quick or very quick. Asteroid will be like instantaneous, right? And drastically. Yeah, so there's nothing really that unusual about a relatively fast rise in temperature in the next 100 or 200 years. Is it man-made? Yes, but so what? I mean, temperature is temperature, right? Whether it's man-made or not isn't really, in that sense, isn't really a factor. Right? Temperature rise means temperature rise, right? So, and by the way, I think I said before, I mean, many climate changes or impacts have been to some degree made by organisms, if not necessarily in such a quick order, right? Remember, oxygen in our atmosphere was produced by plants. There wasn't much oxygen in our atmosphere before plant life came and changed that. We wouldn't be here if plants had not changed the atmosphere and the entire climate. Our entire climate is made not by men, but by plants, right? So, I mean, the idea that living organisms influence the climate isn't new either, okay? So, yeah, relax. Okay. I wanted to talk a bit about symptom and root cause, but maybe I do that next time because I've spent so much time on this. And then I wanted to go back to our Copernican revolutions, and I wanted to talk about population as the main driver. I'll do that next time. This planet does not belong to us. We belong to this planet. That's, by the way, from me. It's not a quote, so I hope you like it. As a philosopher, I would say we are immanent, we're not transcendent, which is contrary to what some religions say, who say we are like a God, we are like the image of God, and we are like transcendent. We transcend nature. We kind of look at nature from the outside and do with nature what we want, right? Control nature. A lot of people put it this way. That's, for example, in the Christian tradition, is a view. My view is dangerous and quite plainly wrong view. I'm suggesting we are immanent to nature. We are fully immanent to nature. We do not transcend nature. At the moment, we don't even transcend this planet. That may change if we start having colonies on Mars, then we've sort of transcended this one planet, but we haven't transcended our solar system, right? And even if we were to transcend our solar system, we would not have transcended, this cluster of solar systems that we're in, and so on, right? So that goes on indefinitely, right? Even if we could transcend this entire universe, I would argue there are probably tons of other universes out there. So, it's a never-ending story. So we will not transcend nature. There is no such thing as a Christian God that transcends nature, and there's never going to be any living being or anything at all that transcends nature. That's my view. You are welcome to have a different view, of course, but this is where I'm coming from. And so what it says is, the planet doesn't belong to us. It's not like our property, even if we sometimes like to carve it up into areas and that this is my property, this is your property. No, we belong to this planet, just like all the other life forms on this planet. And maybe we need to be a bit humble about that, and give ourselves back to this planet and to nature, rather than trying ever more to distance ourselves from it. I don't think it's healthy at all what we're doing, whether it's COVID or otherwise, or climate change, or, we are distancing ourselves more and more from nature, although that's strictly speaking impossible, right? But we are trying to. It's the reason I say it's strictly speaking impossible, because everything we create, even like a computer world that is purely virtual, is still part of nature. It's still submitted to the same physical laws of nature. So we can, strictly speaking, we can't separate from nature, but we pretend all the time that we can. Maybe it's a human trait, and maybe that's even early humans when they had their first tools. That's what they try to do. They try to distance themselves from nature and impose themselves on nature. Yes. I think what I've been arguing is there was a peak where we had the optimum, which was the cave painting period, the Magdalene period, so-called. It's the Stone Age period. The Middle Stone Ages, if you want. Where we had culture, where we had community, where we had language, where we had arts, where we had crafts, we had all of these beautiful things, but yet we were very much living in sync with nature. And ever since, at least ever since we had that agricultural revolution, which in turn then, 200 or 300 years ago, facilitated the so-called industrial revolution, and maybe now facilitates the, if you like, information age. Ever since that point where we became predominantly agriculturalists, I think we've been on a downward slope. That's my subjective feeling. I know there will be people who think otherwise. Right? Oh, this great culture, the Egyptians with the pyramids, and the Romans and the Greeks, of course. And, in China and in India and whatnot, and, the Aztecs and the Khmers, and, all those beautiful temples and structures and things and marvels of engineering and so on and so forth. And some people will just say, look, we are 8 billion now, isn't that wonderful? And yeah, but 8 billion who can't live a human life. So I believe we've long past the peak of human development. Our evolution has stalled, and our blind pushing forward into technologies that are to some degree destructive is just simply blind. And there's always a certain blindness about any innovation, right? Because up front, you cannot know what you get out, right? So you have to be in a way blind, and you have to be willing to go into something blind, right? But I think, and I appreciate that, and I think that's wonderful. But you also, in my view, need moments where you pause and reflect. Yeah, like with the vaccines, for example, wonderful technology, vaccines, they're very effective. If we could just pause and say, well, how are we going to use them effectively? Wouldn't that be wonderful? But we can't, apparently. We have these wonderful vaccines, but we're using them ineffectively. Why? So innovation, I think, involves pushing and halting and pausing and thinking, and then pushing again and halting and pausing and thinking, and then pushing again. I think we are missing the pausing and thinking part. And I think that's not served us well over the last few thousand years on the whole, is my feeling. And it's getting worse. Okay. A brief history of declarations of war. I just was struck that we are now about to declare war on temperature. Temperature being, a physical phenomenon, a non-living physical phenomenon. And at the moment, we're in the midst of declaring war against the common cold virus, which is very abstruse, very weird. And then I thought about, oh, we've always been at war, but I think when you look at literature, which I sometimes do, there used to be periods when, heroes went to war against heroes. And they considered their counterpart sacred. And it was exceptional to go to war against another hero. It was bravery, it was honor. It was a ritual. It had meaning. If you went to fight, when the Greeks went to lay siege to Troy, it had meaning to them. It involved the gods, it involved sacrifices, it involved rituals, it had a purpose, right? Bringing back Helena, if you like. Right? But it was a war between heroes on both sides. There was a great, when you read the Iliad, there's a great amount of respect for each other. It's 10 years of warfare, still there's a great amount of mutual respect. And understanding that we are all humans. And yes, we're going to war because of a reason, but we respect the other side as human. And we understand that the other side also calls upon gods who are powerful, just as our side does. And in a very profound way, we're going to war against equals. That is the nature of war 3,000 years ago. And even maybe still 1,000 or 500 years ago, war was typically a matter of princes going to war against each other. One king against another king, or one prince against another prince. These were aristocrats. These were chosen people of high status who, with a fairly limited army of knights who were, well-trained, well-armored, but they were a select few men. There was still this idea of honor and chivalry in this, right? A select few men, maybe a few thousand typically, or maybe only a few hundred, going to war against another party that was also led by a prince. Yeah. It was war between princes and their knights. Then came a period, 16th, 17th century maybe. We went to, or even earlier during the Crusades, we went to war, we went against witches, women, and infidels. So here they are still human, right? Both witches and infidels were still considered human. But humans of a lower status than yourself. You regarded your enemy no longer as an equal. The princes still basically considered each other as equals. That doesn't mean they weren't ferocious. That doesn't mean they wanted to kill the other one as much as they could, but they were still considering the other side as their equal. Yeah? Maybe no longer as a hero that they almost adored, but as an equal aristocrat. In the moment where we started going to war against witches and infidels, obviously that's a point of view, right? In apostrophes, and the same with witches. Obviously, I don't believe in witches, to be very clear. But people then believed in witches, or at least they pretended that they, and people then really believed that someone who had a different religion was therefore a lower category of human. Still human, but a lower category. You had not only had a right to kill them, you had the duty. If they wouldn't convert, or in the case of the witch, if she wouldn't admit her sin, you had a duty to kill them. Because they were some type of a degenerated human, right? Some kind of a pollution of the human race. They maybe didn't use those words, but something like that, right? So we advance, this is called an advance, I guess, in the 15th, 16th, or even already 11th, 12th, 13th century when the Crusades took place. We advanced from wars between equals to imposing wars on people who were not considered our equals. The witch had largely no defense at all. The infidels, okay, it depended. If they had their own powerful army, they could withstand our attack, as for example, the Muslims did when the Christians attacked them, or vice versa. The Christians were able to defend Spain from Muslim invaders in the long run, but they weren't. The Muslims were able to defend the Near East from Christian invaders, right? So, I mean, either side might win, but either side would not consider the other side quite their equal. Because ideologically or religiously, they were not considered to be their equal. They were infidels. They were like, they had to be either converted or killed. Right? And then came 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, and basically the modern nation state was born when the countries that participated in that conference agreed that there was a monopoly of power lodged in the nation state, or in the state, let's put it this way. Not all of those states were nation states at the time, but some of them were emerging nation states. So that was sort of, if you like, one of the points in the timeline that led us towards the sovereignty of states. Up to the point before, it was still, the sovereignty was still in an individual, maybe a prince, or even the witch. In some ways was considered a sovereign, right? She was treated poorly, tortured for sure and all that, but she was considered someone who had a point of view that you tried to change, right? You thought she was bewitched, so your duty was to unwitch her. And if you couldn't, kill her, okay, but she was still a sovereign. In the moment where sovereignty migrates over to the state, strictly speaking, today I'm not allowed to go to war myself. My state decides whether it's time to go to war, right? And then I'm obliged, if I'm an able-bodied man, or in these days even woman, I'm obliged potentially to join that war effort, whether I agree with it or not. Right? So that ultimate sovereignty of deciding whether you want to go to war is taken away from you. Right? So we've moved from fighting heroes to fighting equals, to fighting unequal humans, to fighting non-human organizations. The state, in the end, is just a legal construct. Of course, it's populated with people, I know, and their leaders, but the whole idea is that it's a state that declares war, not an individual king or leader. And the king, if the king declares, he declares on behalf of the state and the entire population of that state. The member of the population is no longer by themselves able to declare war. In many countries today, they are not even able to carry a weapon for self-defense, right? Because that fundamental right has been taken away from them and invested into the state. Now, at least states, you could argue they still stand for something, right? They have a flag and they have an anthem, and, right? But since then, we have moved on, we have advanced. In the last, I don't know, 50 years or so, we have started to wage war not on states, not on even on people, but on things. We have had a war on drugs. Actually, in the Philippines, it's still ongoing, apparently, a war on drugs. We've had, especially Americans like to do this, war on crime. We've had a war on terror. Yeah. So we no longer even name the other party. You might say, yeah, but behind the drugs, the crime, and the terror are still human beings who sell the drugs, who commit the crime, or who are the terrorists. You know, there are still human beings behind them, but we no longer name them. I mean, at least the Americans, when they went after Osama bin Laden, they at least named him. In some ways, I thought that was positive in a funny way, because at least they gave the enemy a name. At least they honored the enemy by giving them a face and a name. Most of this, we don't even name the enemy. They're anonymous drug dealers or criminals, whatever we decide to be criminals, right? Obviously, those governments who have just taken all our rights away in the last 20 months are not criminals, apparently, right? They commit the greatest crimes possible, but they are not criminals, right? But if you rob a bank, then you're a criminal, yeah. Yeah. So whatever we define to be criminals, but we don't name them any longer. They are anonymous criminals. Even in the case of terrorists, sometimes we still show a picture and say, this is the terrorist, this is the bad man. Then it's more like a witch hunt, right? At least we're going a little bit back to at least naming the enemy, even though we disdain them. But at least we give them the honor of naming them. But in most of these wars, we don't even name who we are up against. We are up against a concept. Not even a thing, really, but a concept. War on concepts. Okay, and then now, right now we are waging war on a virus, of which many biologists think it's not even a life form. You know, it's just a nanoparticle. We are waging war on a nanoparticle right now. And then next time we will be waging war on temperature, which is just a physical measurement. The decline and fall of humanity. Here it is for you. A brief history of declarations of war. And guess where I would like to be on the spectrum? Up northwest, up there. If I ever wanted to go to war, which I have no inclination really, I want to be in a war against other heroes. I want to be a hero in a war with other heroes. I don't want to be in a war against temperatures or viruses or crime or even the state, or let alone witches, which don't exist, right? So you could call this box up there war against illusions, because neither witches nor infidels exist, right? It's just an illusionary thing. So yeah, but they are still, they meant them as humans, they degenerate humans, right? Yeah. The only wars in my mind that are legitimate are the top two, and only on a voluntary basis. Meaning, if you're a prince and you say, okay, I need to gather an army of knights to fight against that other prince, those knights need to be joining you on your war effort voluntarily. Maybe you have to bribe them, you have to promise them land or whatever, right? Or, you know, you can, whatever you conquer, you can raid and plunder or whatever. You can make them promises so that they join you, but it is on a voluntary basis. War against witches and infidels is just delusion, and everything below, you're no longer at war with a human being. You are at war with a legal structure or a concept or a nanoparticle or a physical measurement. It is not war at all. Yeah. The only two wars that I myself think at all legitimate as a human being are the top two. I'm not against war per se. I think it's very human. But I don't think any of those wars down there have anything to do with humanity. They're human wars. And I'm not here to lecture just on wars. I just thought I'd talk about it once because it just came to my mind. I don't know why. It's many, many other things. It's the same. Right? We used to, when we were in those caves, and we had a hunting ground, and there was another tribe or clan of cavemen, you know, in the neighboring cave. We would either have to coexist with them and, you know, okay, we go hunting on this side and let them go on the other side, and let's just protect our women so that they don't steal them. Or if you felt that was too risky and you couldn't bear them in your neighborhood, you might go and try to get rid of them by war. But that is a legitimate war, in my view. That is a legitimate war. It's a war that is about your basic sustenance, your calorie intake, and your replication, for which you need, women who are protected and children who are protected. It's those very basic biological needs of eating and reproducing, which warrant war, in my view, for a human. Not in the normal case. Most of the time you will try to avoid war because it's always risky, and that's the beauty of it. These wars up there, they're always risky for the individual who engages in them. Each individual could get killed. They put their life and their livelihood on the line. That is an honorable thing to do. Now, of course, there will have been cases where they sneaked up on the enemy when they were asleep and slaughtered them all in their sleep. And you might say, that is not very ethically acceptable, is it? And I would say, actually, it is. Yeah. It's maybe sorry, but they were smarter or quicker. They got the others first. Eat or be eaten. That is an ethical point of view, in my view, if you are a hunter-gatherer. To sneak up, if you consider the others a threat or they are minimizing your survival chances, that you preempt that is, I think, ethical. Right? But always considering that the other party can do the same. So in a very fundamental way, it's always a war of equals in some way. One of the parties may come out on top, but the other one could have, if they had been quicker or smarter or more cautious or whatever, right? So it's a typical, like in a duel, you'd see eye to eye and one party will walk away alive, right? There is honor in that. There may be also stupidity, and honor itself may sometimes turn into stupidity, right? Sometimes the right choice is just to say, look, let's just make peace, right? But it is something you look each other into the eye and do. The witches, they don't even look into the eyes anymore. And the state, of course, you can't look into the eyes. The state doesn't even have eyes, and let alone the rest down there. Right? There's no honor in any of that. There's no greatness in any of that. And there's no humanity in any of that. Huh? So I'm pleading, let's stop going to war with nanoparticles and temperatures, please. Okay. Quick breather. That's good. Okay, we're still in a fractured world. I won't have any prices this month, and maybe I'm stopping my prices. I'm tired of them. Maybe you are as well. It takes too long. I have 6 hopefully very quick comments. Omicron, yeah, as we knew, new variant is coming. We don't know yet whether it's really quicker than Delta or not. We will see in the next few weeks. Is it potentially dangerous? As I said before, it's very unlikely that any mutant will be any less harmless than the current versions that are all harmless, as I said many times. Any variant that comes our way will be equally harmless. That's the most likely scenario. There's even a possibility with luck that it learns to avoid slipping down into our lower respiratory system even more effectively. It only slips down in about 1% of the cases, as I said before. So for the virus, as I said, slipping down into our lung is a dead end, or it's, you know, it has no value for the virus really. Even if it can colonize and survive here for a while, it cannot easily transmit from there. So in the end, it dies out. It's a tomb. Our lung becomes the tomb for the virus. It's buried there, right? And our lung is the little cemetery. And it's of no use to the virus, or little use, let's put it this way. So there could be, evolutionary pressure on the virus to try to avoid getting down there, right? But because only in 1% of the cases it happens, my guess is there's just not enough cases to put real pressure on the virus, because 1% is almost like a rounding error from the point of view of the virus, right? If in 99% it doesn't happen, and only in 1% of the cases it happens, there's really not that much likelihood that the virus will mutate in such a way that this becomes less likely. It will not become more likely either. That's what I'm saying. It's not going to be more harmful or less harmless than it is today. But I mean, in theory, with those mutations, anything that kills the host is not really in the interest of the virus, right? So in theory, you could think that this tendency to occasionally slip down into the lung could be reduced further by future mutations, and it could. Theoretically, I would say yes, right? But practically, because the instances are relatively rare, only 1% of all cases, there is probably not enough pressure on the virus to really innovate in that respect, right? So therefore, my best guess is that the number of instances where the virus slips down remains the same. I mean, there's no mutation that reduces that. Of course, what reduces that is vaccinations and natural immunization and demographics and all that, right? But that's all external to the virus, right? But in terms of the virus itself, I don't think it will be under a lot of evolutionary pressure to reduce that, incidence with an accident where it gets caught down in our lung and expires there, right? Especially because it only gets into the lung if it's already been very active up here. So most likely it's already transmitted. So its transmittability is not reduced by ending up in the lung. It's just, in a way, it's largely neutral. It's not helpful for it either, but it's also not really damaging, right? So from the point of view of the virus, it's going to be like, okay, well, it happens occasionally, so be it, right? It doesn't have a strong pressure to mutate out of that, right? And therefore, I think the likelihood is that we'll just more or less remain the same in that respect, right? So I don't expect it to become even more harmless than it already is. But on the other hand, there's also no real reason to assume it would become harmful in some way, right? Usually it wouldn't. I mean, there's no reason for it. The only thing I would say, though, is by us putting so much evolutionary pressure on this virus in general, because our vaccines and the lockdowns are a bit different, but the vaccines work only against this cold virus and not the other 200 cold viruses. So as I explained before, with our vaccine, we are putting this particular cold virus at a disadvantage. We're reducing its competitiveness against the other 200 cold viruses, which compete for exactly the same real estate, right? The same business model, right? So you have 200 plus viruses all competing for the same thing. And this one is being hampered by vaccines, and all the other 200 are not, because the vaccine doesn't affect them. It only affects this one. So that is very significant selective pressure or evolutionary pressure put on this virus, right? Which means it will mutate much faster than without our vaccines, is my prediction. Right? So the current Omicron, which has like 36 spike mutations, where all the previous mutations had only like 10 or less of these mutations, and every spike mutation could potentially have an impact on transmissibility, for example. Okay, so this one has 30-something spike mutations, if I remember correctly. That's quite a jump. You know, alpha, beta, gamma, delta had like 10 or less, and this guy has like 30 or 40. That's a jump, right? So at least there's a suspicion on my part that we are already putting the vaccine so much evolutionary pressure on the thing that not only does it mutate faster, but it mutates in more diverse ways than it might have in nature if you just left it alone and just if you just left this virus to its own devices, as we do with the other 200 competitors. So it would be on an equal footing with them, then it wouldn't mutate that fast probably because it wouldn't have a need to, right? It, you know, be more competitive. So we make it less competitive than the others. We force it to innovate faster, right? And it does. And innovation for virus means mutations that have an impact on the phenotype that is useful to them, you know, and therefore sticks, right? That's innovation for virus. So in other words, they will just keep mutating faster and in maybe more diverse ways than they would have under natural circumstances if we didn't have this vaccination drive. Most likely those mutations are harmless, as I said. They may accelerate in, but that doesn't really matter except that our policy makers don't understand that. So it will terrorize. Every time a new variant comes along, we are terrorized. Right? So the terror just increases because if the pace of mutation increases, the terror increases, right? But physically, it doesn't matter. Yeah? It's not more dangerous or anything like that, in all likelihood. Right? It just terrorizes us more. And so that terror is man-made, right? Because we put that evolutionary pressure on it, and it responds. It's a very rational response. Actually, it's not rational because it doesn't have a brain, but it's in the point of view of nature, that is the logical response, right? It just mutates faster, right? In order to survive. Right? So we make it mutate faster and in more diverse ways through our vaccination drive. And as I said many times before, we should have instead just vaccinated those people who really need it. And which is maybe 10 or 15% or so of the world population, and left the other people alone, then the virus would find enough people unvaccinated, he wouldn't need to mutate that quickly, right? But no, we don't do that. We have to vaccinate everybody and their baby. Okay, well, then the virus will mutate faster as we can. I think that we are now seeing that, in my view. I can't prove that, right? But my gut feel is Omicron is the first post-vaccination drive sign of this accelerated mutation. Nature responding. Nature is just being nature. See, the virus behaves naturally. It's us who are not, remember? So it doesn't mean right or wrong, but it's not natural what we're doing. Right? We're not in sync with nature. You may say, yeah, because we have these powerful brains, we can do that. Yes, we can. But does it always make sense to do that? No, not necessarily, right? So I would argue in this case it doesn't. But we do it anyways, because yeah, that's maybe how we are programmed. So that's all I wanted to say about Omicron. Don't be worried about Omicron, but do notice that we are accelerating this virus's mutations and also the diversity of the mutations. And in doing so, even if the virus doesn't get more dangerous, it may get even quicker. And even if it doesn't get quicker, every time a new mutation or a new variant pops up, we go berserk, right? So we are creating those cycles, ever quicker cycles of going berserk. We are engineering that ourselves. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. The other thing I would want to say, but that's sort of maybe a long shot, it's not impossible that this evolutionary pressure that we're putting on the virus would, if you like, by accident or coincidentally, lead to a mutation that is actually more dangerous for us. It can happen. Right? If we are cornering this virus as we do and forcing it into ever more like fancy mutations, it doesn't want to get more harmful to us. It doesn't, but it could, because all of this happens mechanically. Remember, it's not thought through by the virus. If the virus could think this through, it would be so much smarter than us, right? But it doesn't think, right? It just, these things just happen. It's just a probability curve, basically, right? Mutations, variations happen, and then they either survive or they don't, right? Most don't, right? They only survive if they're useful in terms of survivability or transmissibility of the virus. Otherwise, they don't survive, right? So Omicron obviously is now there, and it seems like it's doing well. I don't know whether it's quicker than Delta. You know, it may coexist with Delta, or it may outcompete Delta eventually. We don't know yet. We'll see. But probably it's no more harmful than any other variety. All I'm saying is the more we push these wild gyrations that the virus has to go through to defend itself against our vaccines, the more likely that something somewhere goes wrong. The virus doesn't want to be dangerous to us, but we may force it upon it without any reason. So the risk, I think, is small, but it's not zero, that we turn a harmless common cold virus into some kind of little monster through our vaccination drive. It's a small risk. I don't want to quantify it. It's probably less than 1%, maybe less than 0.1%. I can't quantify it, right? My gut feel is it's small because the virus doesn't want it, and it would have to be a mutation that has a benefit for the virus. Otherwise, it wouldn't survive. But it sort of goes along with a disbenefit to us. It's hardwired, so there's some kind of change to one of the spikes or whatever, to the chemical compound that is involved, that allows the virus to be quicker or more effective in penetrating us, or more effective in replicating inside of us, while doing some amount of harm to us. But not so much harm that it would kill us right away, because that kind of mutation would not survive, right? That virus would literally destroy its own host, right, very quickly, and that would not survive, right? That kind of mutation, because it would be detrimental to the virus's survival. But if it does harm to us in a way that doesn't really affect the virus, then it can coexist. That mutation can coexist if it's a mutation that on the one hand benefits the virus, and on the other hand, in some other way, disbenefits us, but not the virus. The virus is neutral about it, or might be negative, but it doesn't really matter to the virus. Then that kind of a mutation could survive. Okay. So how probable is that? I don't know. I really have no idea. It's a purely conceptual argument that I'm making at the moment, right? But conceptually, I believe it's sound. We may be driving the virus towards coming up with strange mutations that ultimately can make this virus more harmful to us. And if they're coupled with things that are useful for the virus, these mutations could survive. Okay, meaning it would spread in our population. Some kind of a harm, not sure what, some kind of a harm could spread in our population without affecting the virus's transmissibility or survivability very much. So the virus would just carry that mutant with it. It wouldn't mind. Just like the slippage into our lung, it's not really useful for the virus, but it doesn't really mind because the incidence is relatively rare. And it usually comes after the virus already did the thing they want to do, which is multiply here and transmit, right? The dropping down into the lung usually probably comes later. So the virus is pretty neutral about it. It can be harmful for us, but the virus is neutral about it. Because by the time we get seriously sick, it's already done its job. And as long as it doesn't reduce our population too much, right? It won't notice, right? Whether there are 8 billion of us or 5 million less, that's a rounding error from the point of view of the virus, right? So occasionally dropping into our lung, even though it's an accident, it doesn't really want to go there, it doesn't matter to the virus very much. So that behavior, if you like, will not go away because it doesn't bother the virus, right? And the same would happen if there is a new mutation that is useful to the virus, but harmful to us, but not harmful in a way that it really affects the virus, at least not immediately, then the virus will potentially keep that mutation alive and spread it across our population, right? So I don't know how likely that is to happen. I think, as I said, the likelihood is very low, so I wouldn't be too worried, but conceptually, it is there, I believe. To be confirmed maybe by some virologists who know more about this stuff. If it's there, it just provides another argument against our vaccination mania. I've already provided other arguments, but and I've already provided this argument before. I'm actually repeating myself. I'm just repeating myself because Omicron has arrived, and I think it's the first example of what I said a few months ago, right? Accelerated mutations. Because of the evolutionary pressure our vaccination mania puts on them, right? I can't prove it, as I said. You might say, yeah, but it might have mutated in exactly the same way without any vaccine. Yeah, it might have, but conceptually, it might not have, There's no point us raising our long-term risks, but that's what we are at the moment, I think, are doing. We are elevating our long-term risks for no good reason. So to me, that's pretty irrational. Other things in the fractured world. So Austria has mandated vaccination for all, start February next year. So it's now officially a Nazi state. Merkel is on her way out. Scholz is coming in Germany as chancellor. Scholz has already said he supports the idea of mandatory vaccinations. So Germany may be the next Austria very quickly. The Swiss have just had a plebiscite, as they usually do on important matters. And a majority of Swiss have voted in favor of a vaccination passport. So you have one of the oldest democracies in the world no longer being democratic. They still have plebiscites, but the plebiscite is about a question that is illegal, right? Because it's not provided for in any constitution that you can force a vaccine on people. Certainly a vaccine against a harmless common cold virus. So that's certainly not in line with their constitution, but they have approved it anyways, right? So that's not democracy. That's where democracy breaks down. Democracy has to function within its constitution. There's another case of transcendence, so the voters are now transcending their own constitution without due process. I mean, you can change the constitution, but it requires due process, rightly, right? But most countries have basically suspended their constitution without due process. And whereas German Constitutional Court, which is the most respected entity in terms of institutions in the entire country, has just said the partial lockdowns are legal. So again, basically operating outside of the Article 1 of the German Constitution, in my view. Apparently not in the view of these judges, but yeah, they are not philosophers. That's the problem. Right? Yeah. They only know to operate within the Constitution. They don't realize, I think, that the Constitution has been suspended. So they're now operating outside of the Constitution. Yeah. I also don't think they understand the Constitution. If they approve of lockdown, even whatever partial means exactly, I don't know. I'm sure the devil is in the detail. Like in France, they probably said, oh, certain things are not allowed, but other things are allowed. They probably found some kind of wishy-washy compromise, right? Pleasing no one, because the hawks want the full lockdown and the libertarians want no lockdown, right? And they found some kind of compromise, and they probably say, oh, we are so great, we found a compromise. No, but it's just a very evil compromise, because it just simply doesn't correspond to constitution in Germany. Anyways, and only a philosopher can ultimately decide that. And not that I'm competent to do that. I'm just making a suggestion here. Right? Only a philosopher can ultimately decide that. Because this is not about the law, it's about the constitution of the law, the foundation of the law. Right? And no judge is able to really ultimately judge that, unless they are also philosophers. Some of them may be, that I don't know. There are philosophers of law, and they are the ones who can decide this. Well, they may not decide, but they make a recommendation. They make a judgment because they're qualified to do that. These judges, at the moment, are anyway suspended because the constitution is suspended, so they're meaningless, right? But as I said before, as long as everybody buys into the illusion, it will work. Fauci, the American guy who's advisor to the president and keeps misadvising the president. I just brought him up again because in the last week or two, again, he shows up and vehemently talks in favor of everybody getting vaccinated of every age and as many times as possible. And you remember that at some point I said, well, the guy sounds as if he's been bought by the pharmaceuticals industry. And I don't know that he has been bought by anybody, right? But this is quite amazing. He speaks as if he has been bought by the pharmaceuticals industry. There is absolutely no thinking and no opening of his mind to possibilities. It's just more vaccine, more vaccine, more vaccine, more vaccine, more vaccine. The only people who benefit from that are the pharmaceutical companies who produce these vaccines, right? And I'm not blaming them for producing the vaccines and earning a profit on it. I don't blame them at all. That's how it should be. But Fauci talks as if he has been bought by the pharmaceuticals industry. And even if he hasn't, it doesn't give him any credibility if he sounds like that, right? There will be more and more, and I'm not a conspirational theorist or anything like that, but I'm just observing it doesn't do him any service that he is so single-minded. He's obviously on the war trail against the virus. He's one of those people down there at that bottom box. He would never fit into the hero or the princess box, right? He would never be able to see anybody in the face, into the eyes, without shame, right? So, I'm saying either he has been bought or he sounds like he has been bought. It doesn't really matter to me. And someone who sounds like he has been bought is no longer credible at all. I've never supported most of his arguments. Maybe there have been an occasional argument he made that I did support, but most of his arguments I've not supported, but especially his talk about the vaccines is so counterproductive and, as I said just now, potentially dangerous, because I don't think he has thought about the possibility that our vaccinations may make things worse, even if the likelihood at the moment is low, right? I don't think he has thought about that, or he has dismissed it out of hand without ever sharing that he thought about it. He is single-minded in a way that smells of trouble, something fishy. That's the word. It smells fishy. Okay, that's my quick overview, and then no prices. We had 75% penetration. Yay, that's sort of like a roundish number. 3/4 of humanity outside China have now encountered the virus directly in nature, at least once. Of course, some of these people may already have a second or even a third time, but at least once, right? 75% of us, 3/4 of us have encountered the virus naturally. And you can see the curve has flattened quite a bit, as I predicted. That's partially true, or significantly true, due to the vaccines. And also, it's of course a natural effect of herd immunity, because remember the way I calculate is based on fatalities, and the fatalities naturally are going down as more and more people have been exposed, whether you by vaccine or natural, it doesn't matter. So the natural penetration obviously slows down fatalities, and then the vaccines on top, right? And they overlap significantly, as I said. Unfortunately, one could have designed it such that they don't overlap as much, but anyways, they do overlap significantly. So it's double whammy, but doesn't have a big effect, right? There's still a substantial number of people who are at risk and who have never been exposed to the virus and who haven't got the vaccine, right? So there's still a significant group of people who continue to be at risk of severe pneumonia, meaning the fatalities are still continuing to add up. But at some point they will start decreasing, and we are now entering sort of the middle of the autumn-winter period. Maybe sometime in December we are sort of at I think 21st of December is kind of like the midpoint, or end of December is the midpoint. So we are getting, in the next few weeks, we're getting to the midpoint of the season. That's usually where the peak happens in the Northern Hemisphere. And after that, it starts going down anyways. And so in the next couple of months, we may still have some significant increases here, 1 or 2 or 3 percentage point kind of increases. But then at some point, it will just level off quite significantly and probably never spike up again. Which is good, right? Which is then to show that we've reached the end of the line. The vaccines have captured most of those who haven't yet naturally been exposed. Those who have been exposed, either naturally or vaccine, have informed the immune system what to do, and therefore the likelihood of them in the next infection to have a pneumonia is quite low. And that likelihood, I mean, it will not be zero. It will trend down towards zero, but never reach zero. As I said, all the other cold viruses also occasionally trigger pneumonias. It is always possible, and it will always happen. And for some time, it will happen more for this virus because we're still learning to deal with it, right? It takes a few cycles. I argued maybe we have to meet it a few times in different variants to really have a robust understanding of it, in our immune system, right? And a robust blueprint as to what are the right antibodies. And also it has to be an ongoing process. As the virus mutates, our immune system needs to keep sort of up to speed. So it has to encounter the virus every now and then just to upgrade its software, so to speak, right? So that process will go on over the years until the number of deaths will decline towards zero, but they will not hit zero, but they will become, as I said, I had that other chart, which I didn't bring today, but, where I showed, COVID fatalities on top of the other pneumonia fatalities, remember? And I said, look, next year they will already be much, much smaller than in these 2 years that we've just gone through. And then in 2023, they will be quite modest, right? Almost a rounding error. So, we are not that far away from, in my calculation, if my calculation is correct, we're not that far away from sloping down significantly towards zero, right? Which is great. Problem will be that politicians will not understand that for some time to come. I don't know how long it will take them to catch up with that, right? I mean, the current behavior is so illogical that we have to assume they will continue to be illogical. So it may well be that for years and decades to come, they will force us to vaccinate ourselves, even though it puts pressure on the virus to mutate faster. So it doesn't solve anything. Right? It just makes things potentially worse. Or if you're lucky, it's neutral in terms of the virus. Right? Most likely it's neutral, but it does carry that potential of making things worse. And in parallel, prevents our immune systems from fully encountering this virus in its full nature and in all its diversity. And so by continuing to vaccinate us, the mutations will accelerate and our immune system will decelerate. So we are creating a gap that would not exist in nature. And how severe that gap can become and how big of a problem that may become, I don't know, right? But that's what we're doing. And so if we are a little bit realistic or even slightly pessimistic, our politicians will not understand that. And they will just continue forcing us to widen that gap. And we will always be running behind the virus because the virus will always then be ahead of us ahead of our immune system, because our immune system just doesn't get the chance to catch up. We are forcing the virus to accelerate, and at the same time, we are slowing down our immune system. So the gap will get ever bigger until some point where there's such a big gap that it becomes a problem. Yeah. I'm afraid that's the likely scenario. Right? It's got nothing to do with the virus. It's all us creating a troubled future for ourselves potentially, right? With all these measures that are all completely nonsensical, but they will just terrorize us for years and years and years and years to come. Most likely, it's not going to really be harmful because, luckily, knock wood, this virus is so harmless. Imagine this was a dangerous virus. And we had the same politicians. Imagine afterwards. I can't even think that. Yeah. Thankfully, luckily, this is a harmless virus. So no matter how stupid the politicians and all of us, no matter how stupid we humans are, we can't really screw it up big time because it's so harmless. No matter what stupidity we throw at the virus is largely unfazed. It will just do its thing, and it's harmless because it's just a common cold virus. Luckily. But if we do the same song and dance next time for some virus that is more inherently more dangerous or that has a tendency to do something dangerous, oh my gosh. Oh my, with the same politicians and the same lack of thinking. Oh my God. Wow. Now you might say, yeah, if it really becomes so terrible, then the politicians will learn. Yeah, maybe. I don't know how bad it has to be for politicians to learn anything. I'm not optimistic in that. But yeah, I don't know. Okay. Fatalities, yeah, same. I mean, not rising very fast now. The multiplier is slowly trending down. Remember, it used to be around 2 for a long time. 2 times as many COVID fatalities in my model than reported. But slowly it's dropping down because as I said before, my underlying assumption is that the sort of lack of proper reporting outside China, the lack of proper reporting will tend to go down, right? Or in other words, the accuracy of the reporting goes up, right? So more and more, the numbers now reported will be more and more close to, the accurate number by whatever our definition, right? And I'm not arguing with the definition, even though the definition is iffy and may change, but let's take the definition that we have for what we mean by COVID fatality, but apply it consistently around the world, and then we get the number reported and the number in my model would be the same, right? And we are not doing that. And remember, the early stage, I had a factor of 4. But it keeps trending down, and we're now at 1.85, and it will never go down to 0. No, I don't think so, because there's not enough runtime now left for me to trend it down so significantly, because I can only trend it down as lots of new deaths take place, like in Russia, for example, right now. Russia has a lot of fatalities. Russia had quite a big multiple, but I'm now assuming that they're reporting accurately. So the high multiple from earlier days is now getting increasingly diluted. Yeah, but that dilution only happens if there are a lot of fatalities, right? So if a country has low fatalities, then there's no dilution of that multiplier. Now, many countries are already on a multiplier of 1, meaning I assume that the reported figure is accurate, but there are some exceptions that are notable. Remember, India, I'm at 7.4, I think, factor. Remember, there was a set of studies saying the factor could be as high as 10. We discussed it in a previous session, so I don't want to repeat myself, but I didn't quite accept the 10, but I had a 7, I put it up to 8, and now I'm trending down again. But since India doesn't have that many fatalities right now, I can't trend it down very quickly. So the factor still remains high in India and in a few other places, right? India has a big population, so it has a big impact on this multiplier. So in case you're wondering, is it still almost 2? Are we reporting so poorly? No, but it is a few big countries that drive that number primarily. And then extrapolation to countries in Africa and so on, where I don't really have good data. So that's a guess, right? So there's a few big countries that drive this, and then extrapolation. to countries where I don't have data, but which have big populations. Right? So it's just a model. It's just a model. But I'm trying to have a model that I can explain, that is plausible to me. Unlike what countries report, they don't question their own plausibility at all. I question my plausibility all the time. At least that I can say. Whether I always get it right, no, probably not. But I'm trying to be transparent. That's why I'm sharing this. Right? So this is my best guess. Progressions. Remember, we had a few countries that I've said against the ideal Northern Hemisphere seasonal curve. So Sweden is interesting. They expired most measures, although I don't know whether now with Omicron and so on, whether they're back in business with measures, probably. And the prime minister that I lauded is now gone, right? He's been replaced by a woman. Not that I'm against women prime ministers, but women do have a tendency to be even more scaredy catty than men. So that's not, in this kind of period, that's maybe not a good thing to have a woman, to be honest, even if that sounds sexist. Yeah. And I know you will say, yeah, but you can't generalize. Some women are very tough. Yeah. But if I look at the women like in New Zealand or in Germany that we've had, they haven't done a good job. So I know it's few examples, and many of the men haven't done a good job either. I mean, the Australian guy is a man, and he's just as bad as the New Zealand woman, right? So I admit, right? But still, we have some men in political positions who are a little bit more courageous, right? But among the women, the Scottish woman, for example, she is overcautious and so on. And where we have women in government and we look at them, they tend to be more cautious than men. And at this moment, given what I'm saying, that's not a good thing, right? It's not whether they are women or not, but whether they're too cautious. And unfortunately, women tend to be too cautious in these things, in my view. There's a good reason why thousands and thousands and thousands of years the men ran the politics, Of course, the women ran the politics at home, I know. And they manipulated their men folk very well. But at least when the men went to negotiate with the other hero, they didn't bring the women along. And that was probably a good idea. So this whole idea of, we're all equal now, actually we are not equal, we are different. We are equally important for sure. Even I could argue women are more important than men, but we are equally important. I totally grant that anybody, right? But we're not equal in, biology or psychology. We're different, right? And yes, of course, women and men have different curves and they overlap. Some women are more male than males, and some males are more female than females. I know that, all of that I know. But still, on average, men will be slightly more courageous here. And that is at this stage where we're at, that's actually called for. We would need just men of courage to get us out of this mess. But we have very few men of courage, and the women are not particularly courageous as far as I can see. So I don't know this new prime minister in Sweden. I don't know who she is, but I know she's a woman. I just saw that on TV, and the first reactions are another woman. That's not necessarily a good thing at this stage. Yeah. So she may destroy some of the good things her predecessor has done. And among those good things that the predecessor has done is that, most measures expired, but the cases, rather the fatalities, didn't spike up. So we talked about Sweden, right? They made tactical mistakes at the beginning, so more people died than necessary. But in a way, it's just a time lag. Now they're reaping the benefit, right? Because these were people in the 80s in old folks' homes who were basically dying already, or not far away from dying, with probably highly compromised immune systems. Not all of them. Some of them just had breathing difficulty and they died because they couldn't get oxygen. It was very sad. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to be uncritical about Sweden, right? They made some very sad mistakes early on, but those were tactical mistakes, not strategic mistakes. They got the strategy right. They got the tactics wrong. I want to make that distinction. You may say, yeah, dead is dead. Yeah, but yes, dead is dead. Any dead person is a sad thing, but there's a difference between making a tactical error that you can fix quickly, which they did, and a strategic error, which once you've made it, it's very hard, it turns out in many countries, very hard to turn back. So there's a big difference between those two things. And Sweden had the right strategy. Now that strategy has been, as I said, in the meantime, softened up a bit because of popular pressure or opposition pressure or whatnot. But at the moment, it's still holding up really well. I mean, you would have expected by now a real like winter curve, but not visible yet. Now, Sweden is always a bit time lag of reporting. So these figures in the last week, they will go up because they just haven't reported them all. They wait until the end of the week, apparently, to gather the data fully and then feed it back in. So I talked about this before. Apparently, Sweden is always a little bit behind in reporting. Deliberately so. They probably say this is in favor of accuracy. So we'd rather be a few days late. It doesn't matter, but we want to be accurate. Fair enough, right? So I'm not critiquing that. And I don't know the exact reason, but I can only imagine that there's a plausible reason. But it is a fact they report a bit late, so expect the numbers to be a little bit higher than shown here in the last few days. But you know, the big picture is what it is. In Sweden now, the winter is coming, the case numbers are going up, so the fatalities will also go up, even if they did a good job in targeting the vaccines, which I don't know whether they did. Even if they did, there will be more fatalities, but at the moment it looks they're getting into the winter so far really well. Germany is unfortunately not quite as great, but not surprisingly, right? Because the fatalities per million population at the moment is still the lowest of the 4 countries that I'm talking about here, even lower than Sweden. So just to show you that here Sweden was 1,500. Germany is 1,200. You see, still quite a bit lower. So Germany early on had a lot of measures, a lot of lockdowns, a lot of social distancing and masks and all this stuff. And so it kept the numbers artificially low, especially during the summer when there was almost nothing. And even some virologists were arguing, why don't you just let it go a bit and people can get some natural immunity? No. So Germans have been scarcity cat more than almost any other nation. And, you know, in a way, reaping the price now, or the cost of it, which is the penetration is still very low in Germany. It's about 25% or so. Natural penetration, right? Vaccines are also not so high because a lot of people say, oh, why? It's quite moderate. There's not so many cases, not so many fatalities. So I don't need to vaccinate, right? So the policy of the government has created a picture in which the people don't take the winter seriously. Yeah. And the winter is coming, as you can see, right? And just today, the number is not in here. It's like almost 500. So you can see it's almost here. It's almost at the green line. Yeah. Now they're going into measures again. Predictably, right? Hammer, yo-yo, hammer, yo-yo. Now they have to hammer again, right? Very predictably. Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what you would have expected from a country like Germany, right? So the one thing that is curious is that they are, oh, how could this happen? I mean, they could have just looked at my curve, then they would have known what's going to happen, right? So Sweden is different. Sweden has a mechanism where the people have learned to live with the virus, even though their penetration isn't that much higher than in Germany. It's somewhat higher, but not that much higher. But they've just become very, I mean, the individuals have become smart about behaviors, right? In Germany, they haven't. They've just relied on the government to tell them what to do, like a dog. Yeah, they're behaving like dogs. And now they're like a dog. Oh, why don't I get my favorite bone? Yeah, you don't get your favorite bone because you did a lot of nonsensical stuff over the last 18 months or 20 months. You know, that's why you don't get your favorite bone. And you will have another tough winter. Yeah, predictably. I told you so. I actually did. There we go. So that's Germany. So sorry for you guys. Now, US is an interesting case because I said many times, they're consistently above the curve. Their per million fatalities actually twice as high as in Sweden. Yeah. So they're almost always above the Swedish curve. Remember, the curve is modeled on Sweden. So the US most of the time has been above the curve, especially in the summer periods. And that's maybe because the US is so big and has multiple climate zones. So actually the seasonality of the virus may not be so strictly like it is in Sweden or in Germany, where it's pretty clear cut, because the whole country is more or less in the same climate zone. But the US is so big, it has multiple climate zones. So in different parts of the US, you get slightly different seasonal patterns, and they overlay, as I said before, right? And so you even in the summer, you have some parts of the US where there's a fair amount of activity, right? Also, the US has always been quite liberal. So whenever the numbers were low, they let people do, right? Go about their business in a more or less normal way, which is great for the liberty of the people. But it does mean there are somewhat more fatalities than in a very restrictive regime like in Germany. And also even more than in a regime like Sweden's, which puts the onus on the individual, but the individuals do behave quite responsibly, right? You might say even that is also a form of psychoterror, that the government puts the onus on them, and then they all feel like, oh, okay, now I have to do it, right? Yeah, that's also true, right? But I prefer that over the German version of terror, because at least as a Swede, you can decide yourself how much terror you accept. In Germany, you can't. Right? It's imposed on you. So some Swedes will be very careful and others less so, and that goes with their personality. And therefore, it is much more attuned with who they are than in Germany, where everybody is treated equally, even though some people are very scared of the virus and other people are not scared at all. Some people value their freedom very highly, like I do, and some people apparently don't value their freedom at all, right? So you have a huge variety of people, but they're all being treated equally in Germany. In Sweden, it is, okay, you choose how you best deal with that situation in a responsible way. We are looking to you as an individual to be responsible. And some Swedes will be more responsible than others. Some will go overboard, right? And be more responsible than really makes sense and do things that really aren't very, effective. But they choose to do that as an individual because it suits their personality. I like that model better. It's tailored to the individual rather than tailored to a whole nation of 84 million people with huge diversity in how people think about this. Right? So I much prefer the Swedish way. Now, Sweden also has some national restrictions. Yes, as I said, the prime minister had the right strategy, but he's been softened up by his opposition and by popular opinion or media or whatnot. That's the course of things. I'm not going to go into details there because I don't know the details in Sweden, and I don't need to know the details in Sweden, but generally he had the right approach. It's been diluted to some degree, but not entirely. And what the new prime minister will do, I don't know. Right? We'll see. If the Swedes are lucky, she will continue the same course, but I don't know. She's from the same party, I think. So maybe she does steer a similar course. We'll see. So US, what we had interesting is in the autumn, or sorry, in the summer, late summer, we had a real increase in fatalities. And there was, I think, a combination of the Delta virus really spreading fast, and there was a period of vaccination fatigue. So the US was quick to vaccinate. They were among the first to roll out vaccines, with a very strong program, but they also had very diluted messages, and they had a great variety of opinions. Some states are conservative and they hate vaccination enforcement, and some states are Democrat and they support to some degree an enforcement. And so you have a really ideological debate in the US, which probably has put some people off the vaccination, even though they might have benefited from the vaccine. So even people in the risk group, and they become ideological, and then they say, no, I'm not going to be vaccinated. I'm a Republican in my state, no vaccination, I'm not going to vaccinate, right? Even though maybe they're 70 years old and they actually probably should be vaccinated, right? But they just won't because they hate the whole thing now, right? So you have, I'm not sure this is true, but I can imagine that, knowing a little bit about the United States, that you get a bit of that pushback on ideological grounds that is also irrational, because it doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican. If you're 70, especially if you're male in 70, you really are at a measurable risk, and therefore it really would be plausible and logical for you and rational to get the vaccine, right? But on ideological grounds, some people who should be getting it are not getting it, right? And of course, the inverse is also true. A lot of Americans who don't need it get it because we should all get vaccinated. We follow Fauci. Yeah. So in the US, I think you have a very skewed picture depending on where you are, which state you're in, you know, or which political opinion that person has. It's very ideological in the US. Not that is not rational either, right? I mean, I'm all in favor, you know, of being rational and saying those people who really benefit from it, where there's a measurable protection against measurable risk. The protection is definitely there, but the risk has to be measurable, right? That's what we call a risk group. I mean, measurable in a significant way. I mean, it's like 0.5 or something, you know. I, for one, wouldn't vaccinate myself with that kind of a risk, right? But, you know, if it's 2 or 3 or 4% that you end up hospitalized, then, you know, I would, right? So, and as I've always said, that is a subjective judgment, and everybody can only do that individually. Some people feel threatened by 2% or 3% likelihood of being hospitalized, and others don't, right? What I was saying is you have to make these numbers transparent so people can make an informed judgment and then let them do their judgment, right? But hopefully they will make a rational judgment. Of course, everybody has a slightly different risk profile. Some people are not scared, other people are very scared. I understand. So whatever is rational within their personality and their personal risk profile, that would be wonderful. But we now have people, I bet, who know full well that it would be rational to take the vaccine, but they don't. I won't, because it's now it's war of ideologies. I'm anti-vax, and therefore I won't. Right? That I'm not advocating at all. Right? But the fault lies, among other people, with the Faucis of the world, right? By hammering on those people that you must, he's getting like a yo-yo effect, like a hammering, yeah, hammering, and he's getting pushback. I bet you there are people who are not getting vaccinated, who should be getting vaccinated, but they're not because of people like Fauci. That's why I'm so adamant to bring up these names. There are people who they don't think about the impact of what they say. Right? They say things in public to millions of people on the public TV, and clearly haven't thought about the impact of what they're saying. They either don't care or they just don't get it. I don't know. Or he's, as I said, or he's been bought by the pharmaceuticals. There is something about these people, and I'm just picking Fauci because he's so visible, not because I have any kind of personal vendetta against Mr. Fauci. I don't know Mr. Fauci. Okay, I've never met him. I would never meet him in my life. And he's probably a very nice old gentleman, you know, but he's just, in my view, very wrong and very dangerous. But he's not alone, right? There are thousands like him. He's just the most visible. Right? So I'm just using him as a poster child for a group, for an archetype. That's all. I don't mean it personally, okay? I never mean anything personal, right? I don't know any of the people I'm talking about personally. I'm talking about these people as archetypes of a behavior, okay? Whether it's Merkel or whether it's Fauci or whether it's whoever, right? I'm talking about them not as a person, but as a representation or a representative, really, of a group of people with a certain ideology or thinking, which I want to talk about. I want to talk about that ideology or that thinking or that lack of thinking. I don't really want to talk about the person. I don't really care about the person, you see. I'm just using the person as an archetype or as a figurehead. And because they are, as far as I can see, I'm only using public people who have chosen to be in the public domain, to have a public job and be paid by the public, most of them anyways, I think all of them probably. I feel I have a right to use them in that way. If they were private people, I probably wouldn't. Maybe if they were like a VIP football player or Hollywood star, maybe I would, because it's similar. They choose to be in the public eye. They don't have to talk the way they do, but they choose to. So I think I have a right to pick people who are in the public domain, very influential, but apparently not thinking about what they're saying, and possibly making things worse without maybe realizing it. But yeah, there it is. So I want to highlight those, and I'm picking on some people who are representatives of those things. Yeah. but it's not in the end about Mr. Fauci, and I don't really care whether he has been bought by the pharmaceutical companies or not. I'm not taking him to court. I have no such interest at all. I'm not suggesting anybody should. I'm just suggesting he sounds as if he has been bought by the pharma, and that is not going to help his credibility. Now, maybe that's a good thing, right? Since I don't agree with most of his points, maybe that's a good thing, but it's just so perverse, right? Why doesn't he, why doesn't he just shut up then, right? All right, he doesn't. I guess it's his right to speak. He has the same right as I to speak, right? I'm just making sure that not many people listen to me, then I don't feel bad about if I make a mistake, right? I may make mistakes or may get something wrong, right? And may offend someone, but at least I'm not making any effort to reach many people. If you want to hear my video, you have to go through quite a lot of hoops and loops to find me. And if you do so deliberately, then that is your choice. And then I'm very happy that you're listening. But I'm not trying to broadcast anything. I'm not advertising anything. I'm not trying to influence public opinion. I think I said before, I'm doing this primarily if some aliens come in the future to Earth and dig out records from the past. I want them to find some record that tells them that not all of humanity had been lost, right? Not all of humanity was completely clueless. That's what I want them to find. So that at least they say, oh, okay, these people were not entirely stupid, only the majority of them were. Yeah. And I, for some reason or another, don't consider myself very stupid. So not at least in this matter. I'm probably stupid in some other ways, but in this matter, I don't consider myself stupid. And I do consider most people stupid in this matter, not in other matters. I don't mean that that person is stupid, period. I'm just saying a person may be stupid in this particular question or a similar type of questions, right? That's what I'm talking about. When I say stupid, I mean in this matter or in similar matters, not necessarily other matters. Right? Some people can be very intelligent in how they make money or how they make a career or how they're successful in their sport. Some people can be very talented and clever, no doubt about it. That still doesn't mean that they're able to think rigorously and critically about something like COVID. Most of them can't. That's my point. I can, I think. Okay, UK, also interesting. UK is the quintessential up and downy country. I mean, the prime minister, remember the guy with the yellow woozle hair? He is just, he loves roller coaster rides. He's the guy you can say A today and B tomorrow and then A again without any kind of ado, right? It's amazing. So they have been hammering, yo-yoing, hammering, yo-yoing, hammering. Now, the good thing, as I said, they were among the first to roll out vaccines and they were clever about it. I gave them credit for that. I also gave them credit for what they called Freedom Day. It was not an entire utter Freedom Day, but it went quite far and it was quite robust and clearly communicated. We really mean it and we're not going to easily backtrack on this. And that I really liked. I think in that respect, the UK is ahead of almost all of Europe. And I applaud them for that. They have loosened up most things, not all, and they've done it rigorously. They have so far, and I know this may change now with Omicron, up to like the other day, they had more or less complied with their promise, right? They have apparently realized that the back and forth, up and down policy just confuses everybody and does no good. So even though you could ridicule them for some of their earlier actions, and you could, I think you have to grant them that they've learned something from it. I see more learning in the UK than in almost any other country. So that is to their credit, yeah? And even though I think this Johnson guy is a clown, I think he's probably a very intelligent clown, and I think at heart, he believes in freedom and he doesn't really believe in these measures, right? So the reason he has been flip-flopping is because he's forced by public opinion or by his own people or whatever he has to do something and he feels like he has to say something and do something, but he's not always comfortable with his own announcements, and then he backtracks them when he can, right? And that's why you get this sort of back and forth, which is not very healthy and hasn't served Britain very well. But I think it's gotten him to a point now to say, I'm sick and tired of it myself, and I'm not going to go back and forth like that anymore. I hope. Knock on wood. I hope for Mr. Johnson that he has come to that point, because that would be the right point. And he would have actually learned something from his roller coaster ride and said, okay, we've done our roller coaster, it doesn't lead us anywhere, and now we're going to stick to our guns, right? And those guns that he has are relatively orientated towards freedom. Not entirely, but more so than in most other European countries. And for that, I think I give him a lot of credit. Now, let's see, maybe tomorrow he announces a slew of new measures because of Omicron, and what I just said becomes obsolete. You never know with politicians. But as of today, 1st of December, and not having heard today's news yet, I would say he has so far executed on a policy that is essentially going in the right direction in the last few months. And the numbers prove him right? There was, of course, an increase after Freedom Day. There was some, Britain in the late summer had more fatalities per capita than just about any other European countries. And I'm sure there were a lot of people in Britain who said, look, we have more fatalities. The others are doing much better. They have fewer fatalities. And Johnson and his team said, we are sticking to our policy now because we think it's right. And it was right, and he did stick to it. And so yes, they had more fatalities than some other European countries, but they had not too many fatalities. I mean, quite manageable numbers. And now they're in a position where they have one of the highest penetrations, natural penetrations in Europe, plus on top of that, one of the highest vaccination penetrations in Europe. So like Sweden, for slightly different reasons, I think the UK looks like it could get through this winter quite well. And if they do, and it's too early to celebrate for sure, it's another 4 months to go, but if they do, it will be to the credit of this current government led by Mr. Johnson, the guy with the yellow hair. So I will pay tribute to the guy with the yellow hair. I still think he's a clown, but I think he is quite intelligent. And especially, I think he's able to learn, or he has basically, like Mr. Trump back then, when I talked about Trump, basically the right gut feel in terms of what it means to be a liberal democracy. And it's perhaps not surprising that it is in places like the UK and the US, where at least some members of the political regime have that gut feel. Whereas, for example, in Germany or France, almost zero. Yeah. So there is a difference between those Western democracies. And it may relate to the history, UK and US having a longer history of being democratic, also longer history of, fighting for freedom. France actually would argue they do too, but they don't live by it now. Germany might even argue they do too, because actually in their history there were long periods where they were quite liberal, and more so than maybe some of those other countries, but it's not there now. So I wouldn't be able to fully explain it, but if I'm not mistaken, we might find that really the US and the UK are among those countries that are more liberal, and yet they're not quite as reckless in, let's say, Brazil or Mexico or Russia, where I think there is a mixture of, laissez-faire, but without good care of, the healthcare system, right? So a lot of people die because of secondary effects, because the healthcare system isn't working well, right? That is also not ideal, right? Yes, I'm all in favor of laissez-faire, but you have to have the infrastructure in place. Sweden has that, right? Yes, they made a lot of mistakes at the beginning, but I think they fixed them all and they have a good infrastructure. The US has a pretty decent infrastructure in most places. The UK has a pretty decent infrastructure in most places. Brazil, Mexico, Russia, I don't know. I don't really, I mean, I don't dare to say something because I've never been there, and I haven't looked at the, well, Mexico I've actually been, but I haven't looked at their infrastructure. You know, but I guess that the infrastructure isn't that great. And if you then just do laissez-faire, but you don't provide good advice, good public information, and good you know, healthcare facilities, then a lot of people may actually die unnecessarily, right? And I'm afraid we've seen some of that, right? Maybe not so much in Russia, but maybe in Mexico and Brazil. Yeah, but I am in favor of their leaders leaning towards laissez-faire. I am in favor of that, but you need to couple laissez-faire in terms of your politics with a good infrastructure. You owe your people a good infrastructure. Right? Yes, not everything can be built in a matter of 20 months, but some things could have been. That's why I keep emphasizing that the Swedes made mistakes tactically at the beginning, but they figured it out within a few weeks and rectified it, I think. Right? That is acceptable. I mean, to make mistakes is acceptable, right? But you need to then learn from it and rectify it, right? In Brazil or Mexico, I'm not sure that has happened. Right? So that's not ideal either. Right? But the US and the UK, both of them have pretty high fatality rates, but they also have now pretty high natural penetrations, and coupled with a relatively high degree of freedoms and respect for the law and the constitution, more than in most countries. Not entirely, again, not entirely, but more than in most countries, and coupled with economic development and normal social development and normal social life that is somewhat acceptable, and the number of deaths is somewhat acceptable too in relation to that. It's my take on it. So we may in the end find that the UK and the US got through this on the whole better than other big Western countries like, let's say, Germany, France, Italy, as examples. And that has something to do with their political culture, probably, right? Yeah, we'll continue monitoring. Things can always change within a month. You know that is the case, so we'll see next month. Maybe the story has changed. Okay, divergence, yeah, so I've just defined effective herd immunity at 90% penetration, either natural or vaccination, both count. Even a single vaccination counts for me, so I always take those people who got a double shot plus those who got a single shot, because I believe that a single shot already largely does the trick, not entirely, but even 2 shots don't do it entirely, even 3 shots won't, right? There's always a residual risk, but that residual just gets smaller. But even 1 shot already has a very significant improvement for those who are at risk. So I count the 1 shot. And that's becoming less important because more and more now the number of 2 shots and 1 shot are almost the same. In other words, almost all those people who had 1 shot have also received a 2nd shot. At the beginning, there was a big gap between them, but that's now in pretty much most countries, it's largely closed, meaning also there's a slowdown, right? Because a lot of single shots just means there is a lot of activity. They are shooting, and therefore there are a lot of first shots waiting for the 2nd shot. But if you get to the point where the 2-shot people and the 1-shot people are almost the same, then that means there's not a lot of new first shots being given, right? So in other words, vaccination activity has been leveling off, right? And that's, I think, what we're seeing. So interestingly, Sweden, which I've been lauding, has the longest route to full herd immunity. Why? Because they've been so good at managing the thing. Yeah, so maybe I need to change my storyline, right? Maybe that's not so good. I mean, winter is coming and they will have more fatalities, and this is all driven off fatalities, mind you, right? So their IR, which is the infection rate, will go up. At the moment, it's just very low. The natural infection is only about 40%, and the vaccination rate is average among the Western countries, not more than average, I would say, but probably not less than average either. So and it's that combination, right? Because I have a formula where I calculate, what proportion of the vaccines are being given to those people who really need it, what proportion of those naturally already immunized who were at risk, and then I overlap the two, but not partially overlap. So there's always a residual of people who are neither naturally nor artificially immunized, right? And in Sweden, that proportion is still pretty high. And then I calculate the percentage, the number of months till 90% on the basis of the recent month's data. So in Sweden just had a month where vaccinations increased very slowly, so plateauing, right? And also fatalities plateauing. There have been very few of them, as you just saw on the previous slide. So both growth rates are very slow, and that means it takes to get to 90%. They're not yet there, and it takes another 11 months at the current growth rates. But if Omicron drives a new vaccination drive and vaccinations go up again, and or if the winter drives more natural infections and fatalities go up again, or a combination of both, that time to effective herd immunity can drop very quickly. Yeah. So don't read too much into this. Yeah. I mean, the broad general direction was that the back to normal countries will be quickest, and they have been, that the muddle through will be sort of middling, and they have been, and the new normal countries will take longest, and they have. Now, in the new normal countries, you have countries like South Korea that have been extremely aggressive rolling out vaccines, and you have populations that have a very high natural tendency towards compliance. So whatever the government tells them, they will do. Or even if the government doesn't tell them, their neighbor will, the sort of peer pressure is enormous, right? So everybody, I mean, herd mentality, if you like, everybody will do, right? So if the government, as you remember, in South Korea was very slow with the vaccination program earlier this year. But once they had made up their mind that, oh, vaccination is the way to go, oh, they pushed it through with the most astounding efficiency, and yeah, a lot of people comply. So you go from 0 to 100 very fast. You could never get that in a more Western individualistic society, right? Because there will be always more people who say, no, I don't want to go, I don't like this, I don't want it, thank you, no, thank you. Unless you are like Austria or maybe Germany, who then actually force you to get it, right? Which is then sort of the mechanism that pushes back against that. In South Korea, I don't know whether it's been made a legal requirement. I don't really think so. I think it's just government says you must, and everybody says yes, sir, right? And everybody goes and does it, right? And not just because they are like military men, but because they all think alike, right? And they think in groups, so in the community, I called them the Confucian countries earlier, remember? So once they've made up their mind, they all go in lockstep. And so we have had in South Korea or in Japan or so, we have had countries where only 6 months ago, they were like 20 or 30 months away from getting anywhere, and they've massively accelerated that, right? So they are not further away from things than some of the middle flu countries, as you can see, right? And that's not because their natural immunization is high, it isn't, but because of their vaccination drive, right? And if there's still significant growth in their vaccination, that number here will still come down, right? Of course, at some point, they will probably not reach 100% even in those countries, right? But they will get close to it, right? So at some point, they will just have vaccinated almost everybody, and they will have reached the 90%. Right? Yeah. So they may reach the 90% faster than the model flu countries, because in the model flu countries, it's harder to get people mobilized, right? Because they are skeptics and they're people who think for themselves. Right? Yeah, so it's quite interesting. Anyway, so that's this. Yeah, I don't want to linger on this. Just in terms of the policy mania and what it does, So we're getting close to 10 million COVID fatalities calculated. We are now at 14 million total fatalities, including secondary fatalities from policy measures, so-called excess mortality. Now that figure early next year, we are now starting to be in December. So maybe in about 2 months, or maybe 3, some governments will start publicizing excess mortality figures for 2021. And I will use those to refine this data. And last year I found that there was a lot of refinement. Yeah, because some countries don't regularly report these numbers, and because of COVID, they started to maybe report more, or some countries are refusing to report these numbers because they don't want to be transparent. You know, authoritarian regimes, for example, are in that category, right? So it's very, and plus there's not a lot of good data sources, and they don't, I mean, there's no real systematic capturing through the United Nations or so, like in some other data. And insofar as there is, it's outdated because they're always a few years behind. So it's a tricky one to really figure out what's the excess mortality. It's a tricky one. So I always say that to keep in mind, this is very iffy, this number. And it may change significantly in February or so when I have a new data set. Right? So just keep that in mind. But with again, the best effort I can do, we now have 4.3 million people killed by government policy, and we have 3.2 million saved so far at this point by government policy. Remember that green number, that saved number, continues to go down, right? Because it's the gap between expected and actual, and the actual is affected by the vaccinations. So the vaccinations save lives, right? As they call save lives. So, therefore, thanks to the vaccinations, we will not reach 12.85, as I said. We will just get closer to it, but ever more slowly. So this number, 3.2 million, continues to shrink, but the rate at which it shrinks slows down until it almost becomes zero rate of shrinkage, right? And then it becomes stable, right? So there will be a certain number of people, a couple of millions, maybe, saved by the vaccines or by government policy in general. Right? Now I'm juxtaposing that number to the number of excess mortality over calculated COVID fatalities, right? And remember I've argued that I'm just assuming all excess mortality is due to COVID policy. That is, of course, strictly not correct. There will be some other things, but in the absence of any other major catastrophe, it's not an unreasonable guess, right? It's not an unreasonable approximation, I think. So based on the data available to me, we have about 14 million total fatalities, but only 9.7 million COVID. So it's a difference between of 4.3 million. So 4.3 at this count, and that number, remember, goes up. So the green number goes down every month, and the red number here, the 4.3, goes up, right? So the gap is, every month is becoming a little bit bigger, right? And that gap is the difference between excess people killed by government policy and people saved by government policy, right? And at this current stage, we're already over 1 million. Meaning, if my total excess mortality figures are right, if my COVID estimate is right, governments have killed 1 million, over 1 million people in excess of what they saved. So even in terms of naked, not considering any other factors such as our rights and our constitutions and our economic well-being and our social life, and taking all of that aside for a moment, just taking naked lives lost versus gained, government policies have lost more lives than they gained. Already to the tune of more than 1 million, if my numbers are correct. And that number will still go up in the next few months, right? The other thing I always point out is that the number that people killed by government will have a life expectancy, if they're quite of average persons, you know, suicides and people who didn't get the right treatment and people who didn't get enough food, you know, and some of the I mean, in India, or in places like Peru, many people died, because of government crazy stuff. And I know some of these fatalities, I've always said that, are, what did I call them? Honorable mistakes. It includes honorable mistakes where you say, yeah, these mistakes happened and nobody's really at fault. It's a new phenomenon. People didn't quite know how to behave, and some of that can be excused, right? And must be excused because politicians aren't gods. They're not omniscient, and they make mistakes like all of us, right? So that to some degree, mistakes have to be excused, and this number does include those honorable mistakes. However, more and more, the longer the thing goes on, the more all of these excess mortalities that we are incurring are not excusable, right? At the beginning, they're excusable because you inevitably make some mistakes, and you have to make the mistake in order to learn from it, right? But after 20 months, there is absolutely no mistakes now that are excusable, right? Because there was plenty of time to learn, right? Even to invest, even to build capacity in ICUs, whatever it is, all of that could have been done, right? It's not easy to build capacity because you have to train people, etc. I understand that, but 20 months is a long time. We knew 20 months ago we would need the ICU capacity. I could have calculated it based on my figures. I could have told every single government roughly what peak ICU capacity they should expect, right? No, maybe not every, I'm not God either, right? I mean, in some countries, the seasonality, for example, is very hard to predict, maybe also, right? Or we don't have good data. But generally speaking, I could have given them, if governments had asked me, I could have, in last June or so, I had enough figures to basically tell them what would be the peak ICU utilization under certain scenarios if you do this policy or that policy, for example. Right? You could have had different policy scenarios. I could have calculated that for them. Right? Governments apparently, I mean, maybe they have other people doing the calculation for them, but my hunch is most governments haven't bothered. Right? Yeah. And now again, our ICU capacity is getting scarce. There's no excuse for that now. None. So yeah, but I want to be fair, and yes, this number includes a certain amount of people who died because of honest mistakes. And we can't really blame anybody for that, right? And then there's a certain amount of people who we can blame people for, but I'm not able to tell them apart, right? I can give you a total number, but I cannot tell you how many of those deaths were honest mistakes and how many of them were negligence or even murder, right? I can't. But at least I want to say that, yes, there are honorable mistakes included in these excess modalities, yes. I acknowledge that, right? And we need to acknowledge that. Right? Not all of these excess mortalities can be called murder or negligence, but many of them can, in my view. Okay. Yeah, there's no change here. We are increasing, we are now boostering, but I am not sure whether CNN, where I get my vaccination data, whether they even count boosters. So we at the moment, we've had 3.3 billion people who got at least one jab. They say the total number is 7 billion. So that means most of those people probably have got two. And, some of them already the third, right? Yeah. So, yeah. Actually, to compare with the tens of millions, I should put the 7 billion here, right? But I'm comparing primarily with what proportion of the population should have gotten it and what proportion actually did get it. I'm doing that. But if you want to compare with the tens of billions here, it's now already over 7 billion total shots delivered, right? So when I said tens of billions, I wasn't joking, right? We get a third and a fourth and a fifth. And remember, I said governments may enforce that you have to get multiple different vaccines. Not yet, thankfully. Maybe I was wrong on that prediction. It's not a prediction. It's just flagging a possible risk, not necessarily predicting it will happen, but just saying it could happen. Right? So far, governments seem to be largely saying, okay, we accept all the vaccines, at least those approved by the World Health Organization, we treat them equally, right? when I created the starter, I said, well, maybe they were going to say, oh, you have to have this, this, and this, and this, because we don't know which one is best, and you have to have all of them, right? Or you have to have vaccines for other things as well. Yeah, you know, other items that governments can pile on top. Oh, you need to have not only the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, but we're now going to develop other common cold virus vaccines, and we're going to develop new influenza vaccines that everybody will be forced to take, or whatever, right? I mean, there's a whole universe of things that can still happen. I hope not. Yeah. And, you know, 300% vaccination rate would mean everybody has to be vaccinated and everybody has to have at least 3 shots, right? Then you would be at 300. And how do you get to 1,000? Well, if you have multiple, on top of that, multiple vaccinations against different variants, for example. I mean, today I heard someone, or yesterday I heard someone talk about, oh, we may need new vaccines for the new variant. Yeah. So then people will tell you, yeah, it doesn't matter that you already had 3 of the other version. You now need, you know, the Omicron version, and to be safe, we give you another 3 jabs, right? Then you're already at 6, right? Yeah. And this can just carry on and on and on. And, you know, in 10 years from now, we'll be looking at these numbers and say, oh, Matthias, you were so naive. Your numbers were way too low. Yeah. I hope not. I hope not. But I don't know. Okay, I've changed my long-term scenarios about humanity. I don't want to linger on this now. I think I'd take this to next time because I want to describe it a little bit and I have some, you know, thoughts about it. I had a final thought on all the worlds in lab, but I bring that next time. I want to let you go with Aristotle, famous book, Nicomachean Ethics, famous book of ethics, Greek philosopher, 3rd to 4th century BC, 4th century probably. The masses show themselves to be totally slavish in that they prefer a life suitable to cattle. Nothing changes in 2,500 years. Take care. My Pokemon is still upside down. I'm afraid he's getting a severe headache and he will be upside down for many, many months to come. Nevertheless, I wish you a good day and Merry Christmas. Okay, bye.